ready for war. Bring your army to Casterly Rock by the end of the next moon and have any ships you have brought to Lannisport. Yours sincerely, Tywine. Tijet smiled at the news. War. A great and glorious war. And the perfect chance for me to earn glory and prestige. All in the names of houses Lannick and Lannister. And to create a legacy my children can be proud of when they one day rule Tarbeck Hall. Notes. All are gearing up for the chance of war and the chance of invasion from Essos. Chapter 111, Planning for War. Summary. Ned meets with the Bannermen of the North. And the Bannermen of the Iron Islands are invited to Pike. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Ashura 16. Ashura held hands with Ned as they left their bedchambers and made for the Great Hall, where all nobility of the North were gathered for a feast. And for Ned to speak of his plans for the war. For fighting the Triarchy and for Elia and her children. Ashura was glad that she had convinced Ned to fight, not for Rhaegar, but for her dearest friend and for her children. Her children, one of whom was to be king of the Seven Kingdoms. But, if Rhaegar had his way, Ashura knew that he would arrange for Rhaenys, Aegon and Visenya to marry. As if that would prevent whatever terrible catastrophe from his dreams and night terrors that would haunt the world. Walking together, Ashura felt safe and warm whilst holding Ned's hand, and with her free hand, she rubbed it over her belly, where their third child was growing. And throughout her gestation, this one and when she carried both Prydain and then Elyanna, Ashura almost felt guilty when she would inwardly compare how Ned cared for her and treated her as opposed to how Rhaegar cared and treated Elia. Ashura remembered how Rhaegar simply expected she, Lara and Miria to care for Elia when she carried both Aegon and Visenya. And how he was more interested in reading of his prophecies rather than being by Elia's side or simply just being with her when she was being visited by Pycelle or another doddering fool of a maester. He barely even spent any time with his own beautiful little daughter Rhaenys. Whilst Ned was always by Ashura's side. He would hold her hand and be by her side when they went together to Maester Coleman in the Eyrie or Maester Wallers in Winterfell. And if Ashura needed even a cup of water when she felt thirsty during a gestation, Ned would rush to get a cup of water for her before he would even consider getting one for himself. And she loved seeing him play with Prydain and with Elyanna. Ned would beam as though it was the happiest and most wonderful day of his life. Just when he was spending time with her. Or with their children. All of which only made him incomparable to Rhaegar. Ashura broke from her thoughts when she saw how nervous Ned seemed to be. She lifted the hand she held and then kissed it before she stroked it. "Ned, are you all right?" she asked quietly and gently. He smiled weakly as he turned to face her. I will be when this feast is all over," he replied. She reached to his face and stroked it. "I am right here, Ned. I will always be with you," she said. Ned smiled again before he leant in and kissed her on the lips. "I know. Thank you, my love," he replied. Ashura kissed him again before they continued to walk together to the Great Hall. As they entered the Great Hall, Ashura looked around at the gathered northern nobility. Seeing she and Ned enter, all turned quiet. Ashura could hear her own footsteps and Ned's as they made their way to the head of the main table. And all the northern nobles stood up, with hands holding tankards of ale, beer and mead. All were quiet without there needing to be a herald or Ned needing to raise his voice to be heard. Ashura admired the respect which all northern bannermen all held for Ned. When it would take a herald to announce Aerys' arrival to quieten the royal court of courtiers, nobles and lickspittles in King's Landing. And yet, Ashura could see why they admired Ned so. For completing what Ricard had started. For crushing the south in 4 great battles. For defeating Barristan Selmy in single combat. For tricking Rhaegar into granting humiliating concessions for the north. For awarding land and castles to houses Castle and Poole. And for awarding swords and axes of Valyrian steel to all northern nobility. My lords of the north. I thank you all for coming. For as well as a chance for us to feast and enjoy the success of the North's economy and advancement, we now come closer to a chance of war. With our former trading partners, the Triarchy and their friends, the Black Fires, Ned announced. Ashura glanced at the northern nobles to see their reactions. Roose Bolton, as always, gave nothing away with his expressionless composure as he faced Ned. whilst other nobles looked with indifference, with a thrill for the chance of war or with anger at the mention of the Black Fierce. Ashura remembered Ned telling her how men such as Ricard Carstock, John Umber and Galbart Glover lost their fathers to Maelys the Monstrous and his army. Though the Targaryens and the South in general have so wounded us in the past, we stand a greater chance of suffering nagging wounds should we let Blackfyr and his allies in the Triarchy threaten all of Westeros from across the narrow sea, Ned announced. Ashura was not surprised that the great Jon Umber was the first to speak. Ned. Those Blackfyr cunts slew my father on the stepstones. And I will never pass up the opportunity to slaughter more of the inbred bastards, boomed the Lord of Last Hearth. Other lords of the North voiced their approval of joining the war against the Triarchy and the Black Fierce. Good. I could never leave Elia and her children to fend off against Maegor Blackfyr and Valerys Deltala on their own, and in the horrid city that is the capital. But what will we do to fight in this war, Lord Stark? Asked Jorah Mormont. The Crown Lands will be where their armies and fleets come. They all want to invade and take King's Landing. We should join our armies in the Crown Lands, said Willis Marndale. I will not fight alongside the same scum that murdered Ricard and Brandon Stark, boomed Ricard Carstock. Lord Stark, if I may. What will he say? All turned to the Lord of the Dread Fort as he looked up, unblinkingly, at Ned. Speak, Lord Bolton, said Ned. Rather than join with the southern armies in fighting the Black Fierce and the Triarchy, we should repeat what we had done in the rebellion, the last thing that they would ever suspect. And in this matter, what is it that they would anticipate the least, Lord Bolton? Asked Wyman Marndale. Why, Lord Marndale, we should invade them. And force them to change their plans, whilst we disrupt everything that they planned, whilst we lay waste to all that they hold dear. Invade the Triarchy. Gods, that is a bold plan. And reckless too. Especially when they have hundreds of thousands of men under their command. But then again, Ned faced similar odds when he marched south with only his army. Could this work? Harlon 12. In Pike's Great Hall, Harlon looked around at all the gathered captains and bannermen of the Iron Islands. All men who were eager for glory and for plunder. Even Harlon's brothers were. Even if they believed in Father's new way and reforms, they still yearned to pay the iron price for a reputation and for wealth and plunder. Harlon was proud to see his children sat with he and Alanis at the high table with he, Father, Melissa, Victorian, Donell, Robin and Victorian's liaison wife Mylara, who had just given birth to a daughter, who Victorian adored and had named Thilya, after his mother Thilya Sunderly. One day, Theon, you will be sat where I am sat. As heir to Pike and to the Iron Islands. And as captain of your own ship. Harlon turned to Father as he stood up. Harlon stood up with Donell, Victorian and Robin. He looked around at those captains and lords gathered in the great hall. There were Quentin, Lord of Bleak Bay, Oregon, Lord of Glenthorne and Arryn, Lord of Saltrock. Comrades. Father roared. Harlon glanced at Father, booming as he stood for all to see. All bannermen and captains of the Iron Islands all stood up at seeing him stood. Even though several still believed in the old way, Harlon hoped that they would change their minds when they saw the scale of the armies and fleets of Westeros in the coming storm. You all know of what is happening amongst the weak and puny mainlanders. Across the narrow sea, the Triarchy have allied with the Black Fierce. And now both want to conquer the mainland. This is a glorious chance of war. Of war and plunder. Father roared for all the great hall to hear. And they all roared and cheered at the mention of war and plunder. No matter how reformed the Ironborn are, the chance of glory, war and plunder resonates with all Ironborn. For it is in our blood and our heritage that we earn what we want, through iron, salt and rock. The green and weak mainlanders will never admit to it. But they need us. They need the Iron Fleet. And they need the hardy warriors of the Iron Islands. The Triarchy and their friends amongst the free cities will have many war fleets, ready for battle. As well as sell sails to do their bidding. Neither of which will be a problem for the mighty Iron Fleet, now a total of 150 warships. One of those ships is captained by Robin, who is now a man. Captain of the Iron Shark. So long as the mainlanders recognize our efforts when the war is over, then all will be well. For none of them can hope to gather a war fleet of hardened sailors and fighting men such as the Iron Islands. Our contributions will be critical, especially against their war fleets and against their coastal harbors, forts and cities. Only the Reach and the Westerlands do not welcome us to build trading posts. That must change when the war is over. I know that many of you still think that the old way is the only way and the true way for an Ironborn's way of life. But merely think, comrades. Think of what wealth awaits us across the narrow sea. When we sail and fight against the Triarchy. The drowned god only knows what wealth awaits us aboard their ships and in their cities. The glory and the plunder will be ours for the taking, as it should be. But only if you stand and sail with me. Harlon smiled and nodded when all cheered in reply and raised their tankards to father. He turned to face Harlon as they all drank and talked of glories and plunder awaiting them in Essos. How did that go? Asked father. It went well. And this is the perfect opportunity, said Harlon. For what? Father wondered. Once the Iron Fleet see the gathered might of the mainland kingdoms, on land and on sea, they should realize, even the stupid, fish-fucking cods will realize that we cannot hope to outfight and plunder all the mainland for eternity, Harlon explained. That is what I hope will happen, said father before patting Harlon on the shoulder. Notes. Roose Bolton, cunning as ever, suggests to invade the Triarchy when they are least expecting it, just as they had done in the Northern Rebellion. And the Ironborn are excited as ever for the chance of battle, war, glory and plunder. Any excuse really to leave home and sail, raid, fight and plunder. Chapter 112, A Time of War. Summary. Hoster and Brynden Tully plan on what to do, whilst the Lord of Riverrun is ill with gout. And in Casterly Rock, Tywine meets his bannerman. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Brynden 11. Brynden frowned when he saw Hoster's anger. His anger had waxed because of his gout. And now, with war but a foregone conclusion, his anger increased. Especially that he could not take part in it. What will it take to end the perpetually damned Black Fires? 7 hells, they've lost 5 rebellions. What makes this Maegor Blackfyr think that his chances are greater? Hoster scoffed as he read a letter from his friend in Lies. Believe me, the thought came to mind many times when we were in the Stepstones together. True, brother. However, Maegor is no fool. He has the Triarchy and most of the free cities behind him, something that Demon I, Demon 2, Demon 3, Hegon and Malis never had. And he knows that if he tried to rely on the support of the noble houses of Westeros, it would end as quickly as it had for Demon 3 at Wentwater Bridge, Brynden pointed out. That is correct. But, that being said, the armies and fleets of the Triarchy, that is his only strength that would give our own pause. How many would they be, once fully assembled? Asked Hoster. Depends. What has your liaison friend said about Valerie's allies amongst the free cities? Asked Brynden. Hoster held up the letter once again. He frowned as he read it once more. He says that Valerie's counts amongst the Triarchy's allies, the Prince of Pentos, the Triarchs of Volantis, the Prince of Qohor and the Theocrat of Norphos. Brynden grimaced at each of these powerful allies. The Triarchy could assemble perhaps 150,000 men on the battlefield, as well as less than 200 warships. Whereas its Pentoshi, Norvoshi and Qohoric allies could bring 60,000 fighting men, but only a dozen or so warships. But it is the Volantens that would be the issue. They would bring less than 100,000 fighting men, all hardened from fighting Dothraki, and perhaps less than 100 warships, hardened from fighting pirates of Oldgis. Hoster inhaled and exhaled anxiously. We are heavily outnumbered then. Once they invade, joined by Blackfyr and whatever sellsword armies fall under his command, then the Crown lands, the Riverlands and the Stormlands will fall victim to their brutal touch, he said. No. Not if we are already prepared for war, Brynden said, hoping to give his brother hope. The Riverlands can muster perhaps 50,000 fighting men on the battlefield. As well as 50 warships and 40 transport ships, said Brynden. Those numbers surprised Hoster. That many? He asked. Well, thanks to awarding those castles to landless nobles and settlers moving on to their lands, and thanks to the improvements that Ned introduced to the Riverlands, more folk call the Riverlands home and are willing to fight for their home, Brynden explained. But will this be enough? Even with all the strength of the 7 kingdoms marshalled against the Triarchy, the Blackfyres and their allies amongst the free cities, Will any of this be enough to make a stand? And save the Seven Kingdoms from an enormous war that could drag on for many years? And leave thousands of maidens defiled and thousands of boys and men wounded or dead? What have the Riverlords been saying? Asked Brindon. They are gathering their forces but are awaiting my command. And yet, I feel so fucking hopeless with this damned leg. Hoster snapped as he glared down at the offending leg. Hoster, you will be needed to rule Riverrun and the Riverlands whilst this war is being fought. Should any forces of the Triarchy or the Black Fires set foot in the Riverlands, Brindon pointed out. Hoster grunted in reply before looking back up at him. Put Edmure under my command as my squire. He is nearly 5 and 10. By all rights, he is ready for battle and taking up the sword, said Brindon. The Lord of Riverrun turned to Brindon. You feel that he is ready? I do. He has turned into a capable young warrior. One skilled enough to last well on the battlefield and to be astute and sharp-witted when necessary, Brindon added. Hoster nodded before he looked at the map of the Riverlands on the wall, next to the map of the Seven Kingdoms. His map of the Riverlands had been updated recently to include the castles recently restored and awarded to the new bannermen of House Tully and the Riverlands. He nodded once again as he turned back to face Brindon. Edmure will join you. I will write to the bannermen for them to gather their armies and fleets to Maidenpool. Once all are gathered, we will await command from King's Landing on what we must do next, said Hoster. By then, we should have a better idea on what Daltala and Blackfyr are up to, Brindon added. Indeed. And whatever happens, the Riverlands will be defended, said Hoster. So long as our lands, castles, towns and towns are defended with the necessary garrisons should the war come to our lands, said Brindon. They will be. I will write, for now, that only our best fighting men be marched for war. The rest, to be kept in reserve, just in case war comes on to our lands. The Riverlands has seen enough bloodshed over the many centuries and millennia since the Muds united all the Riverlands into a kingdom, said Hoster. Caitlin 9. The Bannerman of the West, Caitlin thought as she looked around all of those assembled in the dining hall of Casterly Rock. The assembled nobility of the Westerlands from Cricket Hall to Windole were all sat down. And with the Lannister table at the head of them all. And the old lion of Casterly Rock sat in the center, overlooking all those who answered House Lannister's call to arms. Caitlin was sat beside Jaime, who was sat on Tywin's left whilst Tyrion was sat on Tywin's right. She drank only lightly. For she inwardly decided to save any further drinking for only after Tywin had made any necessary announcements for the Bannermen of the West. Looking around at the Bannermen, Caitlin found it interesting that there were fewer Lannisters ever since Tywin had awarded restored castles to his brothers. But in doing so, added more banners to the Westerlands, following House Lannister's command. Which was following father's example, Caitlin knew. Though she was the future Lady of Casterly Rock, Caitlin preferred to keep up to date on all goings-on in the Riverlands and all that involved House Tully and the Riverlands. For it was her girlhood home. And an ally of the Westerlands. Though from how Cersei reacted whenever she was in the same room as she and Jaime, one might have thought that she was an enemy. Even if Tywin was in the room, whilst she would smile poisonously perfectly, when he was not, she would glare openly at she and at her good brother, Tyrion. Caitlin looked down at Cersei. Since the arrangements have been made for her to wed Willers Tyrell, she has been drinking more and more. Jenna and Tyrion were speaking the truth. She does think that she is Tywin's true heir and not Jaime. Caitlin despised Cersei. For her arrogance. For her determination to prove Caitlin either a fool or an idiot who knew not how to play the Game of Thrones. And for her obsession with House Lannister being supreme in all things. Tywin stood. She stood up with Jaime and Tyrion. And all the Bannermen of the Westerlands stood up and faced Tywin with stony silence. My brother keeps a tight leash on the Bannermen. And they know better than to laugh in his presence as they had done in the time of my own father, Jenna had told her. My lords of the West. The time has come again for war. Only this time, it involves all the Seven Kingdoms against a common enemy. An enemy from across the narrow sea, Tywin announced grimly. All were focused on his words and what commands he would issue. For all that Caitlin had known of Tywin, from what she had seen of him and what she had heard of him, all that he commanded was obeyed without question. You all know full well that Valerys Daltala and the Triarchy are allies of Maegor Blackfyr. Both threaten the very stability of the realm. Which is why all the realm shall meet steel with steel. The 7 kingdoms will never again be threatened by the Triarchy. Our 2 old enemies ally to face us. But they will not defeat us. I can assure you of that. Just as I assure you that the West shall never suffer from their brutal touch, nor will our homes ever be threatened by them, Tywine announced. The lords and ladies all clapped or cheered for the Lord of Casterly Rock before he raised his hand for silence. I will assemble and lead the army of the Westerlands towards the Crown Lands. Once it is fully assembled, at Lannisport with 50,000 men, we will march for the Crown Lands. All whilst my cousin, Sir Stafford, shall sail the Westerlands fleet of 50 warships for the Crown Lands, all ready for whatever invasion comes to the Crown Lands, Tywine announced. As they sat back down, Catelyn turned to Jenna. Out of those gathered at the high table with her, she trusted both her and Tyrion to give her answers to difficult questions which she knew that Jaime would not know the answer to. Jaime was quiet whenever he was around her. Still, after several weeks and moons of marriage, he was quiet and reserved around her. Catelyn hoped that he did not dislike her. But she was afraid to ask him of how he felt of her. For she was also worried that his own sister had dug her claws into him and made him want to reject her. What are the chances, do you think, of any noble houses supporting the Black Fyress? Asked Catelyn. Jenna shrugged at that whilst eating a slice of chicken and drinking from a cup of wine. Despite how Jenna ate and drank, Catelyn felt that she did it because of her personal disdain for her free husband. It still amazed Catelyn how Tytos Lannister was so weak-willed that he would marry his own daughter to the second son of Walder Free, who stood with nothing to inherit. I know not. At least, not now. But should Blackfyr win any victories once he invades, then many will turn cloak and join his cause, simply to gain from siding with who they see as the eventual victors of this war, dear Jenna replied. Catelyn looked around the Westerlords. None here will ever support him, will they? She asked with a grin. No. None ever will, especially with my brother as Lord of Casterly Rock, Jenna replied with a chuckle. Catelyn chuckled with her before Jenna faced her. And how are you, Catelyn, dear? Catelyn frowned, not knowing what to say. I fear that Jaime despises me, despite all that I do to show him that I care for him and to remind him that I am his wife, she replied. Jenna grimaced before glancing at Jaime, who had left the table to speak with his old friend, Adamar Brand. Jaime doesn't hate you, dear. He just struggles. From what I know, he had a difficult time when he was an unwilling Kingsguard for Aerys the Mad, said Jenna. Hearing her say that reminded Catelyn of the terrible fate that Bran and Ricard had suffered by command of the evil king. Does all of that haunt Jaime? Yes, it does. Catelyn turned around to face her good brother. You must forgive my brother, Catelyn. But he is haunted by all that he saw in King's Landing. Don't blame yourself. Or think my sweet sister has anything to do with it. Just give him time. And he will see that you are there for him, Tyrion explained. How best to do that? Asked Catelyn. Well, this war, funnily enough. He has always wanted to fight a war. This may be the very thing to take his mind off it. Notes. Brynden and Edmure shall lead the Riverlands army to Maidenpool, whilst Tywine marches the Westerlands army to the Crown Lands. And poor Catelyn feels alone with Jaime being distant from her. Chapter 113, Lord Eddard is going to the war. Summary. Ashura and the Starks say a tearful goodbye to Ned as he leaves. The Bannermen of the North meet in White Harbour with their armies. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Ashura 17. I hate to see him go. Ashura despised seeing Ned leave for war. When he had already risked everything in a war previously. But now he was taking an enormous risk. To invade the Free Cities. To follow Roose Bolton's suggestion to invade the heartland of the Triarchy, and to defeat them on their own ground. And scare them that their country was being invaded, just as they were planning to invade Westeros. It was a brilliant plan, Ashura couldn't deny. And yet, with it came enormous risks. Risks that Ashura didn't want to see Ned make. When they risked his life. And the lives of the Northerners under his command. Ned was sat in his solar with Ashura. Ashura sat by his side. Though exhausted after giving birth to both Halric and Deanna, Ashura didn't want to miss this. To miss Ned before he left home, where he would lead the Winterfell army to White Harbor. Ned remained sat on his seat, looking down at ice, sheathed in his hands whilst he gently inhaled and exhaled. Whilst Ashura rested one hand on his back and her other hand reached out to hold one of his hands. My poor Ned. Damn the Black Fires and the Triarchy for doing this. To threaten the Seven Kingdoms. To threaten Elia and her children. And to threaten Ned and our family. Ned. She and Ned looked up at the doorway. Benjen, newly made Lord of Moat Cailin and head of House Kelstark and recently wed to Joan Elsa Wynn, was stood there. It is time. The Winterfell army are ready. Ned exhaled once more before standing up. Ashura stood up and held his hand whilst his other hand tucked ice under his other arm. They walked together, leaving his solar and exiting the Great Keep and into the courtyard of Winterfell, where his main bodyguard of cavalry were assembled, 50 mounted men at arms whilst the rest of Winterfell's army were assembled outside the walls. Maester Warlers was stood outside with Prydain, Elyanna and both Halric and Deanna were held in the arms of Ashura's newly employed handmaidens, Ros Snow and Melania Paper. Ned patted Benjen on the back. Benjen climbed onto his own horse before Ned turned to face his family. Ned kissed the tiny heads of Halric and Deanna as they were held by Ashura's handmaidens before he took a knee and gently hugged both Prydain and Elyanna. Don't leave, Father Prydain sadly begged. I'm afraid that I must, my boy. Now, you are the Stark of Winterfell whilst I am gone. You be good to your sisters and your brother. You be good to your mother. I will, Father, he said proudly. Ned proudly kissed Prydain's forehead before he turned to Ashura. He stood up and walked to her side, as she tearfully smiled at him. She kissed him and hugged him. Write to us often, she whispered. I will. I promise. They kissed once more, and Ashura looked into his soft grey eyes. I love you, Ned, she whispered. And I love you, Ash. So much, he replied before he kissed her again. Finally, he turned and walked to Frostfoot. He climbed onto Frostfoot's saddle and turned him around. His mounted bodyguard followed him as the small folk of Winterfell cheered for Ned and his men riding. May the gods watch over you. Ned, my love. Eddard XXII. This is it. There is no going back now. This is a war that could change not only Westeros, but all the free cities. Perhaps even change the fate the free cities. In the Merman's court, Eddard stood with all other bannermen of the north. Wyman Marndaly sat at the Merman's seat whilst Eddard was stood next to his seat as they all looked around at a large table. Until a group of servants returned with the required map. Eddard and the lords of the north took a step away from the table whilst the servants laid the map on the table. Eddard looked down on the map as they straightened it and made sure that all the necessary parts of the map were visible for them to see. He sipped from his tankard of Carhold bronze before putting it down on a nearby small table. The large map was of the eastern coastlines of Westeros and the western coastline of Essos, which also covered the free cities from Lorath to Volantis. Also included on the map were the Valyrian roads that ran from as far as Slavers Bay to Volantis. And the one that connected Qohor to Norphos and then to Pentos. Thank you. You may take your leave, said Lord Marndaly. My lord, they said before bowing their heads and leaving the Merman's court. Eddard waited as Willis and Wendell Marndaly started putting figurines of warriors, knights and ships at White Harbor and the same at Pentos, Lys, Myr, Tiosh, Volantis, Norphos and Qohor. My Lord Stark, my spies in the Triarchy report that the Pentoshes have a total of 20,000 men and a dozen warships. The Norvishes also have 20,000, including their famed Holy Guard. And the Qohorics send their army of 20,000, including the dreaded army of the Black Goat, said Lord Marndaly as his sons placed figurines on each of the free cities. And then his sons began to place figurines on Volantis. My lord, the Volantens possess a large army of 75,000 fighting men, including their elite cataphracts and the Volanten warrior elite, their tiger cloaks. And they have under their command a fleet of 80 warships, Lord Marndaly announced. And now, the main forces of the Triarchy, Eddard thought as the sons of Lord Marndaly placed many figurines on the map at Lys, Myr and Tiosh. The Black Fir army is based at Mesilosh, in the disputed lands. They number some 35,000 men, but no ships. And then there is the Triarchy, he said with an almost fearful tone of voice. Eddard frowned when he saw just how many figurines the sons of the Lord of White Harbor were placing on Lys, Myr and Tiosh. The armies of the Triarchy number some 160,000 men and have just assembled over 200 of their own warships. And they have a fleet of 50 sails joining them from Slavers Bay, he added. By the old gods! There's too many of them. Daltala has been planning this war for many years. And now, there is no one in Westeros who is prepared for a war such as this. If they were to invade tomorrow and make landfall by the week's end, no single army in the Crown Lands could possibly withstand the armies of the Triarchy and the Black Fires. Eddard did not show fear to the bannerman. As always, he did not show his emotions physically. He merely looked down at the map and reminded himself of the numbers each of their enemies were bringing into this war. That brings them a combined total of 330,000 fighting men on the battlefield and less than 350 warships. Now would have been the time for the Targaryens to hatch some dragons. We cannot fight them on our own. We can certainly invade, but we could never outfight the armies of the Triarchy, the Black Fires and their allies all on our own. We need help. We need to invite our allies into this war, on our terms. Rather than wait for the war to come in the Crown Lands. What say you, my lord? Asked Meager Sawin. They all believe in me. Because I have led them to war. I have won 4 great victories with them under my command. All in battles in which we were outnumbered. Which shall certainly be the matter in this war. Eddard nodded once before turning to his bannermen. My lords. I have no doubt that once the northern army of 35,000 men lands in the lands of the Free Cities, we would inflict fatal and nagging wounds upon the enemy across the narrow sea. But, from all the information provided by Lord Marndaly, we would be outnumbered 10 to 1. Whilst all northern warriors love the thought of battles of impossible odds, this is clearly a war in which we cannot fight on our own. We will need help. Which is why, we will bring our allies into this war, to join us in our campaign. Eddard turned to the Maester of White Harbor. Maester Lewin, write to our allies in the realm. To Pike, to Storm's End, to Riverrun and to the Eyrie, said Eddard. Yes, my lord. But what to say? Asked the Maester of White Harbor. Inform them of my plan for this campaign and advise them in the strongest possible terms to join us, in that it is the last thing that either Daltala or Black Fira will suspect. As he left for his solar, Eddard looked around the merman's court. Will they join us, my lord? Asked Wyman Marndaly. It is in their best interests to do so, Lord Marndaly. For the Greyjoys, it is a chance of battle and plunder, as they love to do. Despite their reforms, it has been part of their culture for centuries and millennia. And as for the rest, they know that a war fought in the enemy's own territory is the last thing that they will anticipate. And by fighting them on their home grounds, we protect the 7 kingdoms from invasion. Notes. Now Ned invites his closest friends and allies to join in his campaign for the war. How will they respond to it? Chapter 114, A Wedding in Wartime. Summary. Valerys hosts a wedding in his manse for his ward. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Vargid 16. Vargid almost felt pity for the fair Heen girl whom Maegor had personally selected to be his blushing bride. Vimala Heen was reputedly the fairest and purest Valyrian lady of Lys. She smiled with excitement as she and Maegor shared a kiss in front of all the guests. Whilst Maegor just smirked with hunger and lust. The contrast between the two was an interesting one, Vargid found. For Maegor's face was far from handsome. There were lines across his face. From battle scars to frown lines. His muscular chest, torso and shoulders filled out his doublet, despite being fitted specially for him. As for the Heen maiden girl, she couldn't have been more different. Her silky silver gold Valyrian hair reached down to her waist in an intricate braid decorated with exotic jewelry. Her face, hands and neck were decorated with glitter that shone in the sunlight pouring through the skylight. Her dress was translucent, and her breasts and ass were pushing her dress out as though they were grapefruits concealed beneath the dress. That boy will treat her no better than a Dothraki visiting the perfumed gardens. Vargid saw how Maegor grabbed her hand as they all applauded their marriage, and now the bedding was to begin. Vargid rolled his eyes as he dragged her forcefully with him from the great hall that had been converted into a wedding reception for the grand occasion, and the wedded two now went to his bedchambers. Now our king has a queen, said Valeries as they both applauded. Not the first time that Lys has given Valyrian brides to the ruling family of Westeros, Vargid commented, thinking of when King Viserys II wed Lara Rugaria and the two had Aegon IV, Aemon the Dragon Knight and Queen Naerys. Indeed. And when Maegor does become king, he may have an abundance of lands without lords to rule them across Westeros, from Dawn to the north, innocently suggested Valeries. Of course he will. He is relentless in times of war and easily bored in times of peace, Vargid replied. As his blushing bride is soon to discover for herself. He will order a great many executions when he takes the Iron Throne. And he will wipe out all the houses which killed off Black Phyres in the past, Vargid continued. This, Valeries did not deny. That he will. And he will create a hollow space in Westeros with a lack of nobility. Such vacancies will be filled by the Golden Company officers he will inevitably award lands to. As well as Valyrian nobility from here in Lys, and in Tioche, Myr and Volantis, Valeries added. All of which will further your ambitions. To add more to the legacy of old Valyria and the Valyrian freehold. The two walked together to a nearby fountain for water whilst the guests all gathered in the feasting hall, where slaves were preparing food and wine. How are the armies and fleets looking? Are they ready for war? Asked Valeries. They are. And we have had no shortage of more volunteers for both the army and the fleet. Whether willing or not. From Lys itself and from the mainland, Vargid replied. Good. They have a chance to bring honor to Lys and to elevate themselves when the war comes to an end. Whether they see that or not, comes down to them, Valeries commented. And now it is all coming together. Your vision, Valeries, said Vargid. My vision, he asked with an almost amused smirk. Well, you didn't plan this all on the night that you were elected First Magister of Lys, Vargid pointed out. Valeries chuckled lightly at that. True. It is true. I have planned this all for a long time. Though the Temperance Westeros soon-to-be king has never been something I could control, he admitted. Not even his bride will be able to calm the fury in his mind and his blood. Nor will being sat on the Iron Throne and wearing the crown of Aegon the Conqueror, Vargid pointed out. Valeries saw a few of his wife's slaves standing nearby. He gestured for them to go upstairs. Vargid raised a brow at that. A precaution should Maegor's future queen bear the brunt of his displeasure, he explained. Vargid rolled his eyes when he saw the perfumes, cosmetics and powders that the slave girls carried with them as they made their way upstairs to Maegor's bedchambers. Will Balin Rizheen take this as an affront from you, should he find out? Asked Vargid. I shouldn't think so. Though he wants advancement for his family and for his sons to earn glory and perhaps lordships in Westeros, and wants his daughter to be queen. I will have a word with Blackfyr, should he treat his bride badly. And at that, Vargid turned when he heard footsteps on the marble steps of the staircase. He and Valeries turned around. Walking down the marble staircase with a golden balustrade was Maegor, holding hands with his bride. Vargid noticed how she grimaced with each step she made as they walked down the staircase. Her lips looked swollen. Her eyes were red, as though she had been weeping. And it hadn't escaped Vargid's notice how she wore a far different dress than her wedding dress, for the previous one was translucent, and this one was not. That stupid boy. Did his father name him Maegor in the hopes of being a warrior? Or did he have one of those famous dragon dreams and see him becoming a vicious and violent prick? Either way, he will go through Queens as Maegor the Cruel had done when he was king. Valeries. Vargid he greeted simply with a nod and a forced smile. Vimalaheen forced a brief smile on her swollen lips which a shade of dark red lipstick managed to hide. Though Vargid had seen plenty of this on his many trips to brothels, pleasure houses and the pleasure gardens of Lys. It would be in his best interest to award her brothers and cousins with lots of land. Otherwise, he may find himself poisoned the moment that his wife gives birth to a son. Notes. Maegor Blackfyr is now married. Poor Heen girl. Chapter 115, The Iron Fleet. Summary. The Arryns receive Ned's invitation. And the Iron Fleet docks in White Harbor to discuss an alliance. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Elbereth 16. Elbereth beamed as he held up a tiny wooden falcon toy above Harold's head and had it fly around him. Harold giggled as he reached out with his tiny arms to touch the falcon. Elbert looked up at Lysa, who was beaming proudly at Harold and giggling when he giggled. "Our little winged knight is learning to stretch his wings proudly," said Lysa. "As he should. He will one day be a great and legendary knight, winning tourneys across the 7 kingdoms, making many a knight jealous with his victories and with how he makes all the maiden girls and ladies swoon as he rides onto the tourney field," Elbert replied. Maester Coleman entered the nursery. "Begging your pardons, my lord. My lady. Lord Arryn requests the presence of you both in his solar at once," he said. Elbert sat up when he saw the wet nurses stood behind the Maester of the Eyrie. "Very good, Coleman," said Elbert, before he kissed Harold on the forehead. "I'll see you later, young falcon," he said with pride before he stood up. Lysa held Harold's hand as they left together for Uncle John's solar. Arriving, Elbert saw Uncle John holding an opened letter in his hand. From how he was holding it, he noticed that he had already opened it, but was considering what to make of its contents. "Who wrote the letter? And what is in it?" "Uncle." Uncle John finally turned to face them. He beamed at seeing them as they sat down opposite him. "Thank you for coming. This was important and I felt that you both should be in attendance," said Uncle John. "Why? What is it, Lord Arryn?" asked Lysa. "This," he replied before extending his hand out. Elbert took the letter from him. He placed it on the desk in front of him and smoothed it out for both he and Lysa to read it together. "John. Now that war threatens all of the 7 kingdoms, I have come up with a plan that will counter all that the Triarchy and the Black Fires plot. It is my intent to invade the Triarchy, and force them to think again as opposed to invading Westeros with enormous armies and fleets and ransacking castles and cities and selling small folk into slavery. I have assembled the northern army of 35,000 men to White Harbor as well as 40 warships and 60 transport ships. I have written to Quarian Greyjoy, Robert and Hoster Tully my plans for the war, though I have not sent any word to Rhaegar. For I know that in a place such as King's Landing, if they were to get a letter from me tomorrow, Daltala and Blackfyre would know of my plans the day after tomorrow. I have already received a reply from Quarian Greyjoy, and he has accepted my plans and will join the Iron Fleet with us and together we shall sail for the Triarchy. But we cannot do this without the fleets and armies of the Vale, the Stormlands and the Riverlands. We need your help. For it is only with the strength of our 5 kingdoms combined that we can hope to end the threat of a direct incursion on the 7 kingdoms and ending the lives of tens of thousands of small folk. Let me know your answer as soon as possible, John. Yours sincerely, Ned. Gods. What a plan. To invade the Triarchy. And whilst they are marshalling all of their strength together, both on land and on sea. And whilst their allies amongst the free cities are doing the same. Can it work? Ned's plans of direct confrontation in the enemy's heartland certainly worked in the Northern Rebellion. But can it work in Essos? In unfamiliar enemy territory? And with hundreds of thousands of fighting men prepared to take up arms against us? What do you think, Elbert? Asked Uncle John. Elbert looked up at Uncle John at the question. I think that Ned's plan is dangerous and fraught with risk, he replied earnestly. Uncle John could sense that that was half of his answer. But. Elbert sighed as she sat up and replied. But, if you take no risks, you do not win in war. A perfect example would be the Northern Rebellion, where Ned led the Northern Army to confront the armies of the South on their own territory, rather than risk facing them in the North, when he would have had perfect grounds to confront them, especially at the Neck and at Moat Cailin, now fully fortified with 20 towers. So, Uncle. Yes, though the plan is an incredibly risky one and one that could cost us the lives of many thousands of good and able fighting men, it is a plan with merit and that could see us win the war sooner rather than 5 years from now, dragging on until it damages the economy of the 7 kingdoms and kill of more than half of the best and most able-bodied young men of the 7 kingdoms, Elbert replied. He turned to Lysa. She nodded. As you said, it is risky. But it could deal a deadly blow to the Triarchy, just as it had done to Aerys and the Targaryens in the rebellion. But is the Vale ready to support such a move? They both turned to Uncle John at that question. I am glad that you both agree. And yes, Lysa, we are ready. I will send letters to the bannermen to update them on the plan and for them to gather all troops and ships to Gulltown. And from there, Elbert, you will lead the Vale armies to wherever Ned makes his beachhead and join him there. Won't Ned wait for our armies and fleets to be ready to join with his? Asked Albert. I doubt it. For his plan to truly work, he cannot wait. He needs to strike now, before the Triarchy can gain the initiative and begin the invasion. He and the Greyjoys will attack and invade now, is what I suspect. And once they do and make good headway into the Triarchy, then that is when we shall join him. As well as Robert and Hoster, if they agree to the plan also. Harlon 13. The Iron Kraken and the Great Kraken were the first ships to dock at White Harbor, before being joined by the ships of Harlon's brothers and father's principal bannerman. Harlon looked around the only northern city, built by an exiled noble family of the Reach that had willingly sworn fealty to the Starks of Winterfell after their exile from the Reach by the Gardener Kings and their peak rivals. Now this is a city. It makes Lord Sport look like a little trading town. Gods, I do wonder what the great cities of the Far East look like. The one place I have never been, but have always been eager to see, has been Yin, the jewel of the Golden Empire of Yeti, and perhaps one of the hugest and greatest cities in the known world. Harlon turned to father as Victorian. Donell and Robin joined them before Roderick, Baylor, Gorald, Uthor, Vicken, Swain, Dunstan Drum, Walden Wynch, Meldred Merlin, Rogner Awkward, Donna Saltcliffe and Torgan Sunderly. The bannermen, whether they supported father's new way or believed in the old way, looked around at the many warships of the north. Not nearly as many as the Iron Fleet, of course, but they did see just how well armed and armored they were. And at the many hardy and fearsome northern warriors and knights gathered around. It is important that they see that any war with the north or any raids on them would lead to a repeat of what happened to great-grandfather Dagon and how Duncan the Tall slew him. This war will show them the way, as well as being a chance for great glory and even greater plunder. They will see the futility of trying to outfight and raid all the mainland of Westeros. Those ships are larger than our own, Robin commented. Aye, but there are only a few of them, little brother Donell pointed out. Regardless, the men of the north are not soft and simpering mainlander fools. They are a hardy folk. If their war with their southern counterparts is anything to go by, Harlon commented. North or south, mainlanders are mainlanders, brother Victorian pointed out as he crossed his arms and looked around with an unimpressed glance. Perhaps. But their lord is something else. Who? The Mandaeally, asked Robin. No. The Stark. Eddard the young wolf, Harlon explained. At the mention of his name, Victorian and Donell both nodded in agreement. Aye, brother. Now that man is a warrior. To outfight the mainlanders in 4 huge battles and slaughter hundreds and thousands of them. I would have loved to have fought alongside him and fight in battles of impossible odds, Victorian commented. As would I, Donell added. Lads, come. We are being escorted, father called. Harlon walked to father's side whilst a platoon of knights of White Harbor was escorting them to the new castle and to the Merman's court. What make you of the northerners and their men and their ships? Asked Harlon. Their ships would be very sought after for the Iron Fleet, my own grandfather would have said, said father. Harlon grinned at that before he continued. But as for their fighting men, we would be fools to underestimate them. They do not grow up in beautiful green pastures with ceaseless sunshine as they do in the Reach and the Westerlands. The northerners are like us in a way, their climate turns them into hardy men and hardy warriors. And Eddard Stark is evidence of that, father said with admiration. Aye, indeed. You've met the Stark of Winterfell. What say you of him, Harlon? He's a great warrior, no mistaking it. He is about the same height as you, father. Though not as strong or as foreboding as Victorian, he has a presence about him that I could see men would gladly follow him to the fiery pits of their 7 hells and still love him for it, Harlon replied. Father hummed whilst Harlon glanced around at the bannermen. It is easy to forget how much the Ironborn love to sail for raids, battles and war, father commented. Aye. But we have a chance in this war of having a lasting success, Harlon said, reminding him. That we do, he said with a nod. As well as seeing the many gathered armies and fleets of Westeros, that it would be madness to try and take on all of them for no other reason than to try and become another legend of the Iron Islands from before the Targaryens and their dragons set foot on the mainland. But we can only imagine what plunder they will have in the free cities and the Triarchy, father commented. Aye, just so. And with this war, I hope that Theon and Asher will learn the right thing from this. That it is madness to raid and plunder the mainland, That we must live peaceful lives with the mainlanders. And that we must continue to earn their respect and their trust. I will not have my son and my daughter grow up to believe in the stupid old way as Bolon and Euron believed. I need them to believe in the new way. That the Iron Islands might be saved from ancient ignorance. And an invasion like what Johanna Lannister had done to us after the Dance of the Dragons and the slicing of the Red Kraken's throat. They came to the new castle, standing tall and as white as the city's name on its hill. With hardy guardsmen wearing the cloaks of House Marndaly and wielding silver tridents as opposed to spears. At the entrance to the new castle, in the courtyard, stood the nobility of the north. And Harlon looked at who could only be the Marndaly of White Harbor. Wyman Marndaly was perhaps the fattest man he had ever seen. There was no evidence that he was once a great warrior. And yet, he saw his eyes and how they darted around his Ironborn guests. They were sharp and cunning eyes on his face as he smiled jovially for the arrivals from the Iron Islands. And stood next to him was a man that Harlon instantly recognized. Stood with his family's great sword sheathed on his back. Wearing boiled leathers over chainmail and with steel plate pauldrons, greaves, gauntlets and gorget. The Stark of Winterfell was perhaps the most dangerous warrior out of all of those gathered from the north, Harlon decided. Eddard Stark, Harlon whispered to father and his brothers whilst nodding in his direction. That's the young wolf. His great sword looks like it could cut 5 men in half with one blow, Victorian commented. That is the sort of sword that would make your cock hard, wouldn't it, Donell? Asked Robin. Oh aye, little brother. I would be proud to fight any man with a sword like that and claim it for myself just as Harlon and Victorian won their axes, Donell replied. Lord Greyjoy. My lords of the Iron Islands. Welcome to White Harbor and to my home of the new castle. As we gather to fight the Triarchy and the Black Fires, it is an honor to house you here, said the Marndaly of White Harbor before a servant offered bread and salt to them. Father accepted the bread and salt and shook hands with the Marndaly before he shook hands with the Stark of Winterfell. Notes. The Arryns agree to join Ned, in spite of the risks. Whilst the Greyjoys agree, seeing this as an even better chance for battle, glory and plunder. Chapter 116, Affairs of the Realm and Affairs of the Heart. Summary. Rhaegar is planning for war, but has become easily agitated. Meanwhile Baelor fulfills a father figure role to Elya's children. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Rhaegar 17. In the small council, Rhaegar looked over a map of the 7 kingdoms and a map of the free cities. He gulped as he looked at how Pycelle highlighted which ones supported the Triarchy and Blackfyre. And he felt a shiver when he heard how many armies and fleets they had under their command. This will be the greatest war in the history of Westeros. With the entire might of Westeros mustered to defend against nearly the entire mustered might of the free cities. They will talk of this war centuries from now. But it is not the war we should be fighting. All the fighting men from Dawn to the north. All the steel the blacksmiths forge into weapons and armor. All the wood that artisans and fletchers make into shields and arrows. All of this should be dedicated to the war that truly matters. The war against the Great Other. Ravens from across the realm confirm that they are assembling their armies and fleets to fight the Blackfyre menace and their Triarchy allies, Your Grace, said Pycelle. Though a few kingdoms are preparing the best of their fighting men to join with your army, Your Grace, whilst the rest stay at home to defend their castles and towns in case the enemy comes to their lands, Varys added. They should be coming to the Crown lands, all of them, as their king has commanded, said Sidrold. It matters not, Sidrold. In this case, it is good. For 2 reasons, said Rhaegar. Why is that, my king? Asked Jon. Morale will be high as the men will know that their homes and families are being defended. And reserves can be safely called upon to join if worse comes to worse, Rhaegar explained. Elia and Mother both nodded approvingly at that. The war fleets of the Reach are preparing to join the war, Your Grace, but I have had word from Paxter Redwyne and Lytton Hightower that it is taking time to find the men to sail their warships and fight in their armies, said Lucerys. So long as the Redwyne fleet sets sail. That will be the most vital in the war, Lord Valerian, said Richard. What of the Iron Fleet? Asked Miles. A raven from Pike said that they are sailing towards the Kalin Canal, Sir Miles, Pycelle replied. It is good that even the Iron Islands are rising to the occasion and know whom the true enemy is, rather than trying to profit from the chaos as Dalton Greyjoy had done in the Dance of the Dragons, said Mother. Good, was all Rhaegar could think as he overlooked both maps. We do have a chance then. We have a chance of victory. Once the fleets all gather, we can smash their fleets and force them back across the narrow sea. And once they return, we can enforce a peace and demand Daltala to hand over Blackfyr. All the indications are that they will invade the Crown Lands. That is where all previous Blackfyr rebellions have taken place. Maelys the Monstrous was the exception, of course. But thanks to Quarian Greyjoy and my good brother Doran, they no longer have that option. But as Rhaegar looked around the two maps, a doubt nagged on his mind. And as he looked at the north, he felt a shiver. A shiver reminding him of the man who made him shiver ever since he beheaded father. Does he join the war? Or does he intend to support Blackfyr in revenge for whatever grievances he imagines I have inflicted upon him? Does any noble abstain from taking up arms to defend their king and defend the realm? Asked Rhaegar as he looked up at Pycelle. At that, Pycelle cleared his throat before replying. Rhaegar ignored Elia when he saw how she rolled her eyes at where she thought this was going. And how right she was. All the realm have said that they are coming to join this war, my king, in one way or another. As I said, the Iron Fleet has left the Iron Islands under Quarian Greyjoy's leadership and sails through the Kaelin Canal. Lord Tywin Lannister has assembled almighty armies and fleets of the Westerlands for the war. However, there has been no word whatsoever from Eddard Stark and the North. Rhaegar frowned at that. He turned to Varys. Lord Varys. The eunuch master of whispers cleared his throat. My birds sing that Eddard Stark has gathered the very best fighting men of the North and their fleets and is currently with them in White Harbor. But there is no indication as to what they are doing there or where they will go with this army and fleet. Your birds do not know, asked Rhaegar. Alas, they do not, your grace. Eddard Stark has seemingly kept his inner circle close and both he and Lord Marndaeli have done wonders to ensure that none of my birds can ascertain as to what they intend. The damned Northerners. The realm is under threat from the Blackfyres and the Triarchy. And they see fit to betray. To go back on their oaths they swore to me, their king. The king who has saved the world by producing 3 heads for the dragon, that they might save the world from the great other. After the small council session, Rhaegar left for his solar. He began to write a letter to Eddard Stark. To remind him of his priority. And of his oath to Rhaegar. And that by not committing to this war, he was a traitor. To Eddard of House Stark. Lord of Winterfell. Warden of the North. The threat of war ever grows in the Crown Lands, Stark. As you well know. Hundreds of thousands of men of the East prepare to sail and raid and destroy the 7 kingdoms and place a Blackfyr upon the Iron Throne. And yet, what is it that you do? You stay in the North and make no moves to support your king in this most righteous of conflicts. This can only be seen as an act of treason. So, I shall give you one chance. Send word when your army and fleet are headway to coming south, and all shall be forgiven. And should you deserve it, you will be rewarded from the fighting against the Triarchy and the Blackfyres. But remember this, I am king. And I have the power to end the Treaty of Stokeworth. All that you won at the end of the Northern Rebellion, can just as easily be lost at the click of my fingers. You remember that whilst you drink and idle in White Harbor. Yours sincerely. Rhaegar. First of my name. King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men. Lord of the 7 Kingdoms. Protector of the realm. Baelor 13. Elia was not exaggerating. Rhaegar truly does fear and hate Eddard the Young Wolf. Hardly surprising with how he tricked him at Stokeworth and defeated 4 armies with a smaller army. Baelor thought back to his memories of the Battle of Juniper Hall. And how he witnessed Eddard the Young Wolf slay dozens of knights of the Reach and cut down many soldiers and warriors as the Northerners charged the infantry and broke the Reach army as they broke through the ranks before the arrival of the Northern cavalry. The Northern army joined with ours in the Crown Lands could mean everything. Joined with ours, they could crush any army the Triarchy sends or that Blackfyr leads. I have no doubt that Eddard Stark would have no problem with slaughtering the thousands that Daltala intends to send to Westeros. Or does he still hate the South for all that his family have endured? As much as Baylor admired Eddard Stark and the North for what both had accomplished in the Northern Rebellion and since then in times of peace, he knew that they were needed in this war. The battle-hardened and undefeated Northern army could decimate the armies of the Black Fires and the Triarchy. But will he answer Roriger's call? Baylor pushed aside his thoughts of the war as he walked with Elia to the nursery. He smiled when he saw her children. Her beautiful daughter Rhaenys cuddling with her cat Balerion. The girl was now at the age of 5 and was excitedly running around and eagerly playing with her brother, sister and aunt, whom were now at 2 years old. Baylor smiled as he turned to Elia. She was beaming at her children and at her good sister. He turned back to face them. Until he felt a hand hold his. He looked down. He felt his heart race when he looked up to see it was Elia's hand. Just feeling her hand entwined with mine makes me the happiest man in the world, he inwardly decided. Gods, I love her so much. She let go of his hand just as they heard footsteps behind them. It was the Queen Mother. Elia. Sir Baylor. And how are my daughter and my grandchildren? She asked with a beaming smile. The little Princess Rhaenys is playing dragons with them, teaching them how to fly and breathe fire on their enemies, Your Grace, Baylor said with a smile. The Queen Mother beamed at that as she saw Daenerys run to her side and hug Roller's leg. She bent down and hugged and kissed Daenerys' head. If only that they could do such a thing to the Triarchy, to save Westeros from their cruel touch, Roller muttered as she stood back up. If only, Your Grace. If only. Roller took her leave before kissing the head of little Daenerys before doing the same for all her beautiful grandchildren. Forgive me, I must go and see Viserys. My son wants to squire for Sir Gerald and fight against the Triarchy, she said. Would Roriger let such a thing happen? Asked Elia. I would hope not. He is only 12. I do not want to lose any of my family in this terrible war, said Roller. Baylor. Can you come and help play with them with me? You are always so good with them, said Elia. Of course, Baylor replied eagerly as Roller left. Baylor sat down on the floor, next to Aegon. Baylor smiled brightly at him. He felt happy that Elia's only son smiled brightly back at him. He is learning to smile like you do, Elia commented. Perhaps he will be known as the Smiling Dragon when he grows up, Baylor suggested. Just as long as that he means he will be a good king, good to all his subjects, Elia replied. With you as his mother, he could never be otherwise. Baylor glanced around and smiled as he watched Princess Rhaenys talk excitedly with the nursemaids Maya and Sabitha, whom both were beaming with adoration of the little princess. Whilst Elia was holding Balerion and letting Visenya stroke him and hug him, giggling as she touched her sister's cat. Baylor fetched a toy dragon he had bought the Crown Prince recently and had gifted to him on his second name-a-day. He passed it to Aegon. Aegon had started running around with it in his hands and holding it above his head, as though using it to breathe fire on castles and cities. Baylor chuckled at the future king of the Seven Kingdoms. The young prince is quite the dragon rider, Elia, Baylor commented with a smile before standing up, seeing how exhausted the young crown prince was already. I'm not surprised with how much running around he does with his sisters and with his aunt, Baylor thought as Elia stood up and left her children and her good sister in the care of her young maids. Thank you for caring for them with me, Baylor. Roriger barely spends any time with them. It is good for them to spend some time with someone other than just women, she said. Never think that, Elia. You are the best mother any child could ever wish for. You and your good mother both. I am just glad to give a helping hand when it is needed, Baylor replied with a smile as they came to an isolated balcony, overlooking the Red Keep. She beamed at that. Thank you, Baylor, she said before she held his hand again. Baylor glanced around and was glad that the doors to the balcony were shut and it would take an eagle to spot them together there. Gods, I love her so much, he thought as he leant in and held her closely and gently before they shared a deep and long kiss. Notes. Roriger, jealous and fearful of Ned as always, demands that he join the war. Whilst Baylor continues his affair with Elia. Chapter 117, The First Battle. Summary. Robert also joins the war with the army and fleet of the Stormlands. And now the war begins in earnest. Chapter text. Lyanna 12. Lyanna stood in the courtyard of the Round Hall, watching as Robert was issuing commands to the officers of the army of Storm's End. He had received Ned's letter, explaining his plans for the war. And he had accepted them. Robert had sent letters across the storm lands, ordering the bannermen to gather their armies and ships to Thunder Bay. But Robert, following Ned's suggestion, did not tell them for what. He was just hinting that they may be sailing the armies to the Crown Lands rather than marching them there. But the true purpose wouldn't come to light until the day that they set sail. It is with a war such as this, that I wish I could still be back at Winterfell. A trained warrior. And ready to fight for what is mine and what is my family's. But I am Lady of Storm's End now. And I am with child once again. I will stay with Gendry here and rule Storm's End in his name with Harbert and with Renly, she thought as she saw Robert's squire, Artyom, tie down his pauldrons and gauntlets before helping him climb onto Storm Main. Now 8 moons old, Gendry was no longer drinking from Lyanna's breasts. For which she was glad, now that she was carrying their second child. Robert turned to Lyanna with a sad smile. He walked to her side just as Harbert and Renly had appeared. Lyanna was glad that Renly had shown no eagerness to serve as a squire in this war, as opposed to how she would have felt at his age. He clearly doesn't want to fight. Though had this war started back when I was his age, I would have demanded father for me to fight alongside him and serve as his squire. I would never want to force someone into doing something that they didn't want to do. Whether a boy or a girl, they should only fight if they want to or if their duty dictates it so. And Lyanna could see from living in Storm's End and ruling it alongside Robert, just where Harbert's talents lay. And they were in stewardship, which Renly showed a keen interest in, and in spending time with Gendry and playing with his handsome nephew. He could be on the small council one day, once he is old enough and has enough experience of stewardship in Storm's End. Robert could appoint him to a position that he could do good in. I am so sorry, my love, said Robert as he approached her. Say none. For it must be done, she replied. He smiled again with a nod before they shared a deep kiss. I love you so much, Lyanna, he said. And I love you, she replied before kissing his cheek. Robert pressed his hand gently against her belly. I will write as often as I am able. I promise, he said. And I shall write as often as I can. And tell you what names we should name our next child, she replied with a smile. Robert chuckled briefly at that. He then started to squat gently down before he was face to face with Gendry. I will see you soon, my handsome little boy. When this is all over, he said before he leant in and kissed his forehead. He turned to Renly. You do what you do best, Renly, and you care for our family, said Robert. I will, Robert. May the warrior watch over you, he said as the two hugged. Robert is the warrior in human form, Lyanna thought with pride. And then Robert came to his great-uncle. Uncle, there are no words I can say. Say none, Robert, lad. As always, I will be here, for House Baratheon. You just make all your Baratheon ancestors proud by smashing those foreign pricks with your hammer in the thousands, Harbert said before patting Robert on the shoulder. Robert smiled before nodding. That I shall. They will soon learn to fear the banners of House Baratheon of Storm's End soon enough, Robert said with pride before he walked back to Lyanna and Gendry. He hugged Lyanna gently and kissed her forehead. I love you so much, my love. And I love you. As they broke from their embrace, Lyanna faced him. Be careful. Promise me. I will. I promise, my love, said Robert before he leant in and they shared another kiss. Robert looked down on Gendry, still being closely held by Lyanna. Now you be a good boy to your mother, Gendry, won't you? Asked Robert before he gently hugged him and kissed his forehead. Eddard 23. We have a chance here. The Triarchy and the Black Fires will not know of what we intend. And not even the little birds of Varys the Spider will know. Just as I intend. But how best to use this chance? For we shall never have such a chance as this again. Aboard the flagship of the Northern Fleet, the Great Green Hand, the bannermen of the North and the Iron Islands gathered in the captain's cabin. The map of the Free Cities was sprawled across the captain's table. Eddard looked at the map, wondering where best to strike first at the enemy. Has there been any movement of enemy armies? Asked Quayan Greyjoy. There has, Lord Greyjoy, said Sir Willis before he read from a letter sent to him by his Lord Father. The Pentoshi army, led by Prince Tychidos Enerys, have left their home and marched to Myr to join with the Mirish armies gathered there, said the heir to White Harbour. The bulk of the enemy armies are in the Triarchy itself. To sail for there now would be suicide. Even with surprise on our side, they would have hundreds of ships waiting and ready for battle in their harbors, said Roderick Harlaw, Lord of 10 Towers. What would you suggest then, Lord Harlaw? Asked Roose Bolton. The Lord of 10 Towers cleared his throat before gesturing to Mirish lands. The heartland of the Triarchy will be filled with armies and fleets. What we need is somewhere safe and isolated that we could safely disembark from and gather our forces and make a plan of attack on the Triarchy, he suggested. His plan has merit, Eddard thought with a nod. Where then would be the best place to land? On the edge of Mirish lands to the north, asked Jorah Mormont. No. We cannot, Lord Mormont. Since the war's beginning, Del Tala has locked down the borders of the Triarchy as a whole. Whole platoons of sellswords patrol the countryside looking for spies or infiltrators, said Sir Willis. But as he said this, Eddard noticed something on the map. He realized that the borders between Pentos and Myr were noticeably bare. What of the borderlands shared between Pentos and Myr? He asked. All eyes turned to where he had spoken of. Cliffs mostly on the coastlines, but for a place called the Red Beach, replied the second son of the Lord of White Harbour. There is a risk, Lord Stark, said Galbart Glover. There always is, Lord Glover. But no battle nor war has ever been won without risk. We have risked everything to make it this far. But so long as we stay our course, we have a chance of an undeniable victory, Eddard explained. Eddard turned to Sir Willis. How long until the fleet reaches the Red Beach? A whole day, Lord Stark, assuming that we don't have to silence a sea patrol on the way, he replied. And if we come across such a patrol, that would deny us the element of surprise on the enemy, asked Baelor Blacktide. Then I'll take care of them proudly, said Victorian Greyjoy. Now, Eddard looked up at the Lord of the Iron Islands. Lord Greyjoy, send your fastest ship to scout the Red Beach and see if there is an enemy presence there. If there is, we can prepare to crush them and force them from the beach. If not, all the better, said Eddard. Quayan Greyjoy turned to his youngest son. Robin. You will go. Yes, father. Lord Stark, said Robin Greyjoy. The Ironborn captains and lords returned to their own ships whilst Eddard and the bannermen of the north retired, either to their own ships or to their beds aboard the Great Green Hand, where Eddard had a bed. As he curled into bed, he looked at the most recent letter from Ash. It had arrived in White Harbour on the day they had departed from the city. Gods, Ash. My love. How I miss you. And our children. As much as Eddard was talented at fighting and leading men on the battlefield, he did not relish the promise of battle and bloodshed. Instead, he thought of Ash and their children. Of seeing them again in Winterfell. And never having to leave home and fight in wars again. But, as always, he reminded himself of why. Of why this war was being fought. Of why it demanded both he and the fighting men of the North. And why it had to be that the North was involved. Chapter 118, The Red Beach. Summary. The Starks and Greyjoys attack the Pentoshi army. With the Great Yonumber leading the attack. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Interlude 12. Jon Great Yonumber, Clive Standen. Battle and glory, Jon thought as he eagerly looked ahead. He could see the thousands of soldiers breaking camp and getting ready to resume their march. If they thought that they would not see any battle this early in the war, they were very much mistaken, Jon thought with a grin as he fastened his great sword to his back. The Lord of Last Hearth was ready for battle. Robin Greyjoy had returned from his scouting voyage and had reported that the Pentoshi army, led by Prince Tychidos himself, was camped near the Red Beach and had been joined by an army of 5,000 sellswords. And so, Lord Stark had given the command for the Pentoshi army to be attacked by the armies aboard the first wave of ships. Which Jon was grateful that he was a part of. Now he had a chance of battle. And of wielding his family's new ancestral weapon in battle for the first time. This was a great sword of Valyrian steel which had been named Behemoth. 7 feet in length, blade and hilt both, and wider by half an inch than ice. Jon had wielded it several times in practice back home in Last Hearth. And he loved wielding it. The only times he ever used it other than training was when he would personally execute wildling leaders captured by his men or deserters from the Night's Watch. But now he could take Behemoth into battle. And slaughter hundreds of men with it. Jon looked around at his gathered men. Last Hearth had 2 warships and 2 transport ships in its fleet, ever since they had been directed by Ned to build a port and harbour on Umber lands. A task which John had appointed Uncle Moores in charge of, and whom was now commander of House Umber's fleet and captain of their flagship, the Giant of the Sea. John. Uncle Hotar was pointing to their west. John turned to see the great green hand, where Ned was leading the Winterfell army and was leading the attack. But John wanted to be the first to land on Pentoshi shores. Row harder. Row, lads. Show the Pentoshi Cheesemongers the strength of the men of Last Hearth. John roared for all of them to hear. John was glad to see them get closer. And as they were within a mile of landing, John laughed when he saw that the Pentoshis had finally taken notice of them. They were getting into defensive formations and breaking the order of march in which they were preparing on the road. John looked around at the other ships that were taking part in the attack. He saw the ships of Ricard Carstark, William Dustin, Gregor Forrester, Mark Riswell, Jorah Mormont, Willis Marndaley and Wendell Marndaley. And then there were their Iron-born allies, Roderick Harlaw, Harlon, Victorian, Donell and Robin Greyjoy, Dunstan Drum, Swain Botley, Baylor Blacktide and Gorold Goodbrother. John began to slowly unsheath Behemoth from its scabbard. And as the Giant of the Sea ran aground and pierced onto the sands of the Red Beach, John reached out and grabbed the balustrade of the ship and pulled himself up. He roared as he jumped down onto the water. The water, reaching up to his knees, broke his fall. He looked up as the Pentoshi were still mustering. They didn't even have any archers shooting down on them. Ha! Stupid pricks. They should have stuck with trading and selling cheese rather than fighting. John roared as the men of Last Hearth followed him, including Uncle Moores and Uncle Hotar. As the warriors of Last Hearth joined him, they began to charge up the beach. And he saw a few thousand Pentoshi soldiers charge down the hill towards them. Hold here, lads. John roared as he lifted Behemoth up high. About time that I take this into battle. I wonder if I can behead as many men as Ned had done in the last war. I saw him behead 10 men with a single swing of ice. The warriors, village champions and berserkers of Last Hearth held their shields up as the Pentoshis charged down the small hill towards them. And as they charged, John swung Behemoth at them. 6 men lost their heads with just that single swing of his sword. Gods, that was magnificent. He punched a man hard in his face. He fell to the ground, knocked out from the single punch and with his nose and jaw broken. And now the men of Last Hearth began the butcher's work. John broke the necks of 2 men with just a simple punch to their neck bones before he bisected 3 men with Behemoth. Gods, wielding Behemoth is so much fucking fun. The great Jon Umber took delight in wielding Behemoth in battle against the Pentoshi Cheesemongers. He laughed as he beheaded 7 soldiers with a single swing of House Umber's great sword. My little John will have so much fun wielding this sword in battle when he is old enough. He turned to see the rest of the first wave make landfall and charge to join battle, just as the rest of the Pentoshi army were doing the same. All but their cavalry. And no archers came to the aid of the infantry, to not shoot their own men, John decided as he raised Behemoth up and bisected a Pentoshi field commander. John looked around for his uncles. He smiled when he saw Uncle Hotar bisecting a man with a single swing of his great sword. And he saw Uncle Moores impale an Unsullied with his own spear before ripping the head off another Unsullied with only his bare hands. But John's attention was drawn to the hill where the Pentoshi cavalry were situated when he heard an Isozi war horn blare. But as he looked at the hill, he noticed the cavalry all surrounding a single man. This single man was dressed in very fanciful Isozi armor. It was gold-colored lamella over black chainmail and silver-colored steel plating that was decorated with Valyrian imagery and glyphs. That must be Prince Tychidos. John stabbed a spearman and took his spear. Men of Last Hearth. With me. Take spears. Take spears, he roared. I will not miss this chance of eternal glory. For me and for House Umber. Behemoth will claim that prince's fancy head. The cavalry drew swords and readied themselves to charge as John and the Umber force broke through and charged straight for them. But it was too late for them. For John stabbed a horse in the throat with his spear before he threw the spear at the chest of another horseman. The horse he stabbed fell to the ground, dead. And the rider was swiftly beheaded by a single swing of Behemoth before the men of Last Hearth fell upon the cavalry, quickly slaughtering the horsemen before John came towards the Prince of Pentos himself. He cut down 3 more cavalrymen before he came towards the Pentoshi prince. He drew an arrow and shouted in Pentoshi before riding towards John. John swung Behemoth across sideways at him. The fancy armor he wore did not protect him from Behemoth's eternally sharp blade. He fell from his horse's saddle and landed on the blooded sands below. He managed to stand up to face John. John struck at his sword. The beautifully decorated sword shattered into pieces like broken glass before John grabbed him by his shoulder and threw him to the ground. John lifted Behemoth up high and sliced it down, ignoring the pleas for mercy from the prince before it cleaved his head off. Notes. No better way to start a war like this. Chapter 119, Crossing the Narrow Sea. Summary. News of Ned's invasion spreads to the Triarchy and to King's Landing. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Vargid 17. For fuck's sake. I would much rather listen to the whining of my newborn than be stuck here and listening to the inane prattle of these fat and useless merchants and magisters. There is a war to fight. And all they can do is argue and drink expensive wine and eat fanciful foods. Vargid hated being in the great council chambers. He was a warrior. He needed to be on a horse and giving commands and fighting and killing as he had been doing his entire life before Valeries took him under his command. But, as Gonfalonier of Lies and the new position of Grand Gonfalonier of the Triarchy, he was required to spend time in the great council chambers of Lies. He rolled his eyes at the arguing and shouting from the magisters of Lies and the visiting magisters from Myr and Tioche. Few, such as he and Valeries, kept quiet. Whilst the politicians argued, shouted over each other and debated pointlessly. Whilst they argue like little children, there is a war to be fought. We should have invaded them without them knowing. Now, all of Westeros might will be arrayed against us before our armies even set foot in the Crown lands, announced Sarthos Dargaron. Vargid sighed with annoyance at those who voice in favor with his statement or disagreed with Dargaron's point. For no other reason than for pride. As if any of these cowards and fat bastards have ever fought a battle ever. Vargid sighed with annoyance at their arguing. Gods, they are giving me an aching in my head. Enough. All quietened down at Vargid's raised voice. All chances of surprise are lost. And now all of Westeros gathers its banners for war. Vargid announced as he stood at the center of the great council chambers, occasionally glancing at the first magister's seat, where Valeries was sat and was patiently watching the day's events. What know we of where their armies prepare for us? Asked Vargid. My spies in their capital tell me that they are preparing for a siege. We must expect their armies all gathered in the Crown lands, shouted Lysano Pendaeris. Vargid hummed at that. A sensible course of action. Only for him to be shouted down. Nonsense, Pendaeris. It would take them too long to mobilize their armies and march them to their crown lands from their distant homelands such as Dawn and the North. At this very moment, they gather all their fleets to attack ours on the narrow sea. They may even reach out to get the Bravosis as allies, shouted Malar Orthiz. And not rely on their armies winning the war. An uncommon way of fighting a war. And having Bravos as an ally would be a smart thing to do. But will the Westerosi reach out to Bravos? This is ridiculous. No fleet would set sail. For the Triarchy controls the narrow sea. Their disunited fleets would be crushed by the mighty fleets of the Triarchy before they could even plan and organize a battle against us. I am certain that they will gather their fleets at Dragonstone, Estermont and the Stepstones. They will use them as stepping stones to fight off our fleets, knowing full well that their armies would be crushed if they dared to face ours, announced Hannaris Ardaris, Gonfalonier of Tioche. Mention of the Stepstones, Estermont and Dragonstone worried numerous magisters of the Triarchy gathered in the great council chambers, Vargid noticed as he looked around. That is all just guesswork and speculation. We cannot ignore the threats they pose. They would never dare such a foolhardy plan. We should launch attacks on their ports and harbors to prevent their use. Again, Vargid rolled his eyes at their arguing. I need a fucking drink. Else I will end up killing most of these useless, fat magisters. Vargid often calmed himself by reaching for his arrow. Not to draw it and wield it. But to feel the comfort in holding the hilt of his weapon and feeling safe. Until the Mirish Gonfalonier, Balaquodraha, made himself heard over the loud arguments between magisters. They will not wait for us to make the first move. My sellswords in the north say that the northern army and the Iron Fleet have crossed the narrow sea and invaded Pentos. Invade Pentos? That's madness. Many a magister laughed across the great council chambers. But only Vargid and Valeries did not laugh. For Vargid recognized the danger. He remembered how the Pentoshes had not fortified their borders and built watchtowers, forts or had sent patrols to regularly patrol the countryside. Silence. All turned silent again when Vargid shouted for all to hear. He turned and gestured to Valeries. My friends. It is a grave situation we find ourselves in. But we will do what we must to win this war. I have complete confidence in our armies and fleets to crush the enemies and to seat the true heir to the Iron Throne as King of Westeros, he announced. But, Pentos. What if what Drahar said was right? Could they have invaded Pentos? Elia 18. Elia inhaled and exhaled gently and calmly as she, Roriga and Rolla stepped from out of the shadows and into the throne room, accompanied by Sir Lyle and Sir Geoffrey. As she walked towards her own throne, she made a cursory glance around all the nobility gathered in the throne room. She recognized numerous nobility of the Crown lands, the Westerlands, the Reach and Dawn. But the noticeable absences were of the North, the Riverlands, the Stormlands and the Vale. The Iron Islands, she was less surprised by, for the last news of them was that the Iron Fleet had passed through the Kalin Canal. And yet, they still had no news from the North. Even after her letter to the North. Though she rolled her eyes as she remembered that Roriga had written a letter to Winterfell also. Hoster Tully was also absent. Though Varys had said that the Lord of Riverrun was ill with gout. But the armies of the Riverlands were assembling at Maidenpool, along with the fleets of the Riverlands. Though Elia wondered why the elite of the Riverlands armies were gathering at Maidenpool and not marching straight for the Crown lands. The same was in the Stormlands and the Vale, where Robert Baratheon was personally leading the best of the armies of the Stormlands to the newly built city of Thunder Bay and home to Robert's younger brother, Stannis, newly made Lord of Thunder Bay and founder of House Durathion of Thunder Bay. And in the Vale, Elbereth Arryn led the best of the Vale's army to Gulltown, where the Vale fleet was also gathering. Roriga was sat on the Iron Throne, looking down at all those who were gathered in the throne room. Elia looked at the lords paramount that were present. She smiled when she saw her brothers Doran and Oberyn. And she saw Mace Tyrell surrounded by his own bannermen. And Tywin Lannister stood alongside Jaime. Lords of the Crown lands, of Dorne, the Reach and the Westerlands. I bid you all welcome to the capital, said Roriga. He allowed a few moments for them to politely clap before he spoke up again. Know that all of you gathered here today have the eternal gratitude of Queen Elia and I in bringing your armies and fleets to fight for the most righteous of causes, to defend the realm and its people from the brutal Triarchy and their puppet, Maegor Blackfyr. Roriga said grandly. Elia glanced at the assembled nobility. But as they applauded Roriga's speech, Elia noticed Varys rush to the Iron Throne. He was holding a letter in his hand. And Elia could see the urgency on his face. What could this be about? Varys has never once rushed to the Iron Throne with a letter. Even during Aerys' time. Something very important has happened. But what? Sir Barristan allowed him to pass. Roriga paused his speech and turned to the Master of Whispers. My king. My birds have just sung me a song from across the narrow sea. You must read it at once, he said with urgency. Both Elia and Roriga read the letter. My lord. A combined fleet of the Iron Islands and the North just dropped an army of 35,000 Northerners onto the borderlands between Myr and Pentos. In a battle at a place called Red Beach, the Starks and Greyjoy slaughtered the Pentoshi army and slew the Prince of Pentos. The army now camps at the borders, waiting. For what, I do not know. But what is certain that Eddard Stark now leads a large army in Essos and Quarian Greyjoy leads the Iron Fleet and the Northern Fleet and has begun attacking Pentoshi ships and is sailing straight for Pentos itself, to raid it, I presume. The Swallow. Elia gasped at what she had just read. She couldn't quite believe it. Ned is in Mirish lands. And he has slain the Prince of Pentos. Elia looked up at the nobility. All looked very curious at what they were reading and what it was that had captured their attention so. Elia turned to Roriga. Roriga, say something to them, she said. Roriga looked up at Elia and then turned to the nobility. Realizing what she had meant, he had cleared the throat. My lords, forgive me. I have only just received a most excellent piece of news. Following my command to surprise the enemy, the Starks and Greyjoys have landed an army at the border between Pentos and Myr and crushed the Pentoshi army and slew the Prince of Pentos. Roriga. What in the seven hells are you doing? Elia briefly glowered at Roriga whilst the nobility all clapped and cheered at this good news. But she did notice how men such as Tywin Lannister narrowed his eyes with suspicion at Roriga, as though disbelieving him instantly. But in the meantime, whilst the Starks and Greyjoys are causing chaos in Essos, we must be ready to join the war and continue the fight to protect the Seven Kingdoms, he announced. As the nobility cleared from the throne room, Elia glared as she turned to Roriga. What in the seven hells was that, Roriga? She demanded. Doing what is always done. Ensuring that the Iron Throne is respected. And that the realm believes in victory and in their king winning this war. Elia merely shook her head at him. And you can only accomplish that by lying, she asked before taking her leave. Where are you going? He demanded. To write to Ash and to apologize for what you said in your letters to Winterfell and in what you have lied and claimed just now, she snapped in reply. Eddard may have just begun to save the realm. But, will the armies and fleets of Westeros be mustered in time to join him in the war? Notes. Whilst the ruling government of the Triarchy does not believe the news is truthful, the news comes as a massive shock to Westeros. And it's only the beginning. Chapter 120, Reinforcements have come. Summary. Ned and his army are joined by allies from across the Narrow Sea. And the Triarchy learn that the stories of Ned's invasion were in fact true. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Brynden 12. Brynden looked around with surprise. He saw the Stark banners flying high for all to see. As well as the banners of all other houses of the north. Seeing the Northern army, Brynden felt confident. Ned must have brought over 30,000 Northerners to this war. More than half of them will be veterans of the last war. And with Ned leading them, then this war shall conclude a lot sooner than any would have anticipated. We might have a chance of turning this war from a long one and into a short one. As Brynden climbed down from the Tully flagship, the river chaser, he turned around to see Ed Muir repeatedly scratching itches and wiping the sweat from his brow. He shouldn't be complaining. The climate here is wonderful. Now the climate in the Stepstones, that was awful. There was humid sunshine, no fresh water, sand fleas, stinging flies, scorpions, serpents and hardened black fyrcel swords hiding behind every rock. We had to wait for ships to come from the Stormlands every day to bring barrels of fresh water to replenish what we had already drank during the day. Drink water, Ed Muir. And stick to the shade whenever possible, Brynden advised his young nephew. Yes, uncle, said Ed Muir, who promptly drank from his water skin. Brynden looked up at the northern campsite, where the Northerners had made us of a cliff face for shelter. As the Riverlands army made landfall and began to unload from the ships, Brynden saw the arrival of the Stormlanders and the Valiman. There must be over 70,000 in our army right now. Now we have a chance of victory. If only the rest of the Seven Kingdoms woke up right now and joined with us. Brynden walked with Ed Muir and the bannermen of the Riverlands to the campsite. As they approached, Brynden smiled when he recognized a familiar face. Willam Dustin, Lord of Barrowton. Lord Dustin, he said with a nod. Sir Brynden. It is good to see you and a strong army of the Riverlands join us, he said with a smile. We are glad to join you, said Brynden before the two shook hands. Willam winked at Ed Muir and patted him on the shoulder before he escorted them to Ned's pavilion. We heard plenty of the Battle of the Red Beach on the voyage here, Brynden commented. Aye. And what a battle that was. The Pentoshes were so weak and disorganized, it was like charging upon an army of disorganized small folk armed with cutlery, he replied. Brynden and Ed Muir were the first to enter the pavilion. Brynden smiled as he shook hands with many comrades he fought alongside in the Northern Rebellion. Sir Brynden, welcome, said Ned before the two shook hands. Welcome, Lord Ed Muir, he added before shaking hands with Brynden's nephew. As Brynden introduced them to the Riverlords, Robert and Elbereth arrived with the Valorlords and Stormlords into the pavilion. Brynden smiled as both he and Ned shook hands with Elbereth and Robert. Well, Brindon shook hands with Robert, whilst Ned and Robert held a brotherly hug. Once the introductions were over, Ned stood at the front for all to hear. "My lords, I would like to thank you all for coming here and following my directive for this war to break the fighting spirit of the Triarchy and prevent any invasion they have planned for Westeros, and in doing so, protecting our families, our homes and our subjects back home." Feelings which all men present all voiced their agreement to. But now, we must make our next move. So far, the Triarchy have made only one move, and that is to gather all of their armies into the disputed lands and keep their fleets in Lys, Myr and Teosh. Now that we are all here, we number an army of 80,000 men. But there is a Myrish army which marches back to Myr, having heard that we are here and have no wish to leave their city unprotected, Ned announced. "How many does this Myrish army amount to, Lord Stark?" asked Tytos Blackwood. "The same numbers as our own, Lord Blackwood," Ned replied. "How far away from the city of Myr itself are we, Lord Stark?" asked Eamon Estermont. "One day, if we were to march today. But if we were to march tomorrow, all armies gathered here today would be better rested and fed in case they offer battle," he explained. "He's right. It is too risky to march now. We must let the men rest and get used to being on dry land once again before they can march and fight in a war. For many of them, it will be their first war. Except for a majority of the Northerners." "Where is the Iron Fleet and Lord Greyjoy, Lord Stark?" asked Jon. "They are raiding the Pentoshi shipping lines and coastal routes. Lord Greyjoy is acting under my command to attack Pentos and attack in such a way that they will pay a ransom for them to leave and have their assurances that they will leave the war for good," Eddard explained. "Very clever. And none better to do this sort of convincing than the Ironborn." But then, Brindon had a plan. "Lord Stark, what if we were to do the same to the Myrish and this army?" he asked. "What do you mean, Sir Brindon?" asked Ned. "We march tomorrow morning. And we march to confront the Myrish army, right outside the city itself. And whilst all eyes of the city are on the battle, no one will be watching a small battalion of men sneaking underneath the walls and taking the city in a surprise siege assault. We would gain control of the city without a long, dull and bloody siege and scare the Triarchy that we had taken one of their cities just like that." Vargid 18. Eddard Stark truly has balls of Valyrian steel. To invade the borders between Myr and Pentos. Gods, if he was on our side, we would have won the war by now. But, he is our foe. A situation none of us saw coming, Valeries commented to Vargid as he sat opposite him in his solar in the Great Council chambers. "Indeed. Though, how we get out of it, that is what we must focus on," Vargid replied. "True. In all my plans for this war, I never pictured Eddard Stark being an issue. Or even the Westerosi directly invading the Triarchy via Pentos. It is a very clever move. Should we send word to Stark? Bribe him to leave and focus on the invasion once again?" Vargid wondered. "A man such as Eddard Stark? I doubt it. Though he may not hold any love for Rhaegar, he would not serve under Maegor. And Maegor would want him dead for even being a mere obstacle in his way of taking the Iron Throne," said Valeries. "True. But we could do it. We could reach out to Stark. And offer him to serve on Maegor's small council, perhaps as his hand of the king. As well as coin and discounted deals with all the Triarchy and our neighbors and allies, even stretching as far as Slavers Bay." "What does the soon-to-be king think of the newest development?" asked Vargid. "He has been most aggrieved at the news. To the extent that not even his fair and beautiful wife has been able to calm him down. So, I have dispatched girls from the pleasure gardens to him," he explained. "Has that worked?" asked Vargid. "Not well enough. It distracts him, but he is quickly reminded of the events at the Red Beach and then he in turn decides to bother me," Valeries said with annoyance. "And this volatile boy still thinks himself a king. He may be a brilliant warrior, but that alone does not make a king. He would know that if he wasn't so weak that he would force himself on girls and women and beat them to harden his own cock." Before Vargid could continue, there was a knock on the door. "Exo. Magisters Pendaeris, or this, Heen and Rugaria are here to see you. They say it is a matter of the greatest urgency," said Batyatos. "Allow them inside," Batyatos Valeries commanded. Vargid rolled his eyes when he heard the frustrated voices of those who would think to question Valeries in the Great Council. An outrage. A complete and utter outrage, muttered Malar Orthes as he and his counterparts entered Valerie's solar, whilst Vargid had his back to them. What is an outrage, Orthes? Did your favorite concubine laugh at your cock rather than suck it? Or has your wife been caught abed with your handsome master-at-arms? I know that your daughters have fallen to his charms in the past, Vargid thought with a suppressed grin. Dearest friends, welcome. I apologize for the state of my solar. Had I known that you were all coming, I would have been better prepared, said Valeries with a pleasant smile. But Vargid spotted the impatient and annoyed glare in his eyes at how they had the impudence to enter his solar like this and even speak uncouthly of him. You know full well why we are here, Your Excellency, said Pendaeris. Your Excellency, this is an affront to the Triarchy. Not even Demon Targaryen did such a thing in his conflict with us at the Stepstones. And he was an arrogant Targaryen prince who rode Vigor, a dragon as large as Balerion the Black Dread, angrily said Malar Orthes. Vargid could only roll his eyes at how stupid they were in thinking that they would accomplish anything by confronting Valeries directly in this way. And yet, when Vargid faced Valeries, he was surprised. For he was calmly looking at them with a calm and neutral composure. It is a direct provocation to the free cities, to the Triarchy and to our beloved Lies the Lovely, my friends. Which is why, I am taking direct action, Valeries replied. They looked surprised by his speech. Good. Then you will march all our armies to Myr to defeat the Stark invader, demanded Pendaeris. I'd love to see you try and take command during a war. You would be shitting yourself so much, that all that fat would disappear and you would be as thin as a slave on the slavers' market. I have already sent messages to Pentos, to Myr, to Qohor and to Norphos. That they will dispatch armies at once to defeat the Stark invader and his newly arrived allies. The Magisters of Pentos have even gathered a sellsword army as well as hiring the services of Dothrakikal Balakho and his Khalasar of 25,000 riders, said Valeries. They finally left, quiet and no longer mocking and insulting Valeries. Vargid rolled his eyes at them as the door was shut behind them. I admire how you put up with them and how they question every move you make, Vargid commented. It comes from a lifetime of tolerating such behavior from Magisters and their families, my friend. The trick is to always keep a mask of composure, which always throws them off, right before you go in for the kill and throw them off their mark, Valeries explained before drinking from his wine cup. Notes. The Arryns, Baratheons and Tullys join Ned to start their campaign in earnest. And Valeries has plans to stop Ned before he gets any further. Chapter 121, The Free City of Myr. Summary. The Allied army marches to the Free City of Myr. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Robert XVI. Gods, this is the life. It gave Robert a great sense of pride to be leading the Stormlands army to war. An army from across the Stormlands. Even including Stormlanders from the noble houses that supported that ginger, boot-licking lickspittle of cousin Roriger. Even Ronald Connington had joined him in the campaign in Essos. He won't be delivering ravens to his cousin, telling him of our every move. And trying to have me overthrown for high treason. Unlike his cousin, he is a good man. A fine Stormlander. And a good warrior. Robert rode alongside Ned and Elbert. The three talked of their lives at home. With Elbert talking of his young son, Harold, and his marriage with Lysa. Ned happily talked of his marriage with the unnaturally beautiful Ashuradain and their 4 children, Prydain, Eliana, Halric and Deanna. Fuck, Ned must be like a stallion in bed to have 4 children with perhaps the most beautiful woman in the world. And how is Lyanna finding it as Lady of Storm's End, asked Ned. Will you not ask her for yourself and come and see Storm's End, asked Robert. No, of course I will. But when I have the time to do so. I have barely had any time to do anything but spend time with Ash in Winterfell, Ned replied. I hardly think that spending time with a wife who is as beautiful as Ashuradain is something to complain about, Elbert replied with a knowing smirk. At that, Ned had an enormous grin spread across his face. Oh, Elbert, my friend. You will never ever hear any such complaints from me about my lady wife, Ned said with pride. Robert burst out laughing at Ned's words. Gods, I have missed this. The 3 of us riding together. With nothing but the open road in front of us. and telling each other our dreams and what I would do when I got home and what Ned would do when he got home. I should welcome wards to Storm's End. To give Gendry the chance to make friends. Perhaps from other noble families in the Stormlands. And maybe even families from the Lord's paramountcy. Though I would have to speak with Lyanna about that first. Their chatter came to an end when they saw Mark Ryswell riding hard towards them. Robert remembered Mark very well from the tourney at Harrenhal. He was one of the best riders he had ever met in his life. And he served as a scout in the Northern Rebellion and as the commander of the Ryswell cavalry in the 4 battles they fought. And here, Ned had appointed him as commander of the scouts. Lord Stark, he called as he halted his horse just ahead of Ned, Robert, Elbereth and Brynden. Let's hear it, Mark said Ned. The Mirish army is here, Ned 80,000 men. Commanded by the Mirish Gonfalonia, Balaquodra he said. Where are they? Asked the Blackfish of Riverrun. 5 miles away, Sir Brynden. Right on the outskirts of the city. They look to be marching to confront us here, said Mark. Well, we shall confront them instead. Mark, keep a watchful eye on our flanks. I want no surprises as we march to face them, Ned commanded. Aye, Ned, he replied before riding away. Ned turned to his commanders. Double the pace. We head out to meet the Mirish now. Ned boomed for all to hear. Robert reached for his hammer in excitement. Whilst also remembering he had antler sheathed at his side. Robert felt it strange. He had rarely used a sword in combat. He had always preferred to use a hammer. To demonstrate and flaunt his great physical strength for all the world to see when he swung it to kill. And because he knew that a hit from a warhammer was either a crippling injury or instant death. But antler. It was a beautiful sword. A sword of Valyrian steel. And Robert agreed with Lyanna's suggestion. That he keep it for close quarters out on the battlefield. They marched further afield until they came to the outskirts of Myr. Myr's high walls were barely as high as the walls of Riverrun. But the city was as expansive as Storm's End and Riverrun combined. And it was truly magnificent to look at from a distance. But what marred the city's beauty was the huge army awaiting outside its walls. Get the infantry spread out into lines. Pikes and spears in front. Archers behind. Get ready for battle, lads. Cavalry and knights at the flanks. Ned commanded for all to hear. Minor lords began issuing the commands whilst Robert and Elbereth rode towards Ned and Brynden to plan the battle. Mark said that they had just 15,000 cavalry and the rest are all infantry and archers, Ned said. Is this the entire Mirish army? Asked Elbereth. It must be. Nothing to spur an army to disobey orders and march back than the news of an enemy army being so close to their home, Brynden pointed out. What will we do? Asked Robert. That depends on Drahar and what move he makes, Ned replied. As if to answer that question, the Mirish army began to march towards them. With infantry spread out and all their cavalry gathered on their right flank. Elbereth. Take the Knights of the Vale and Stormlands with you and ride for our opposite flank. Keep them hidden until you hear my horn. Brynden, you will take command of the Riverlands Knights and cavalry and that of the Norths. Yes, but to do what, Ned? Asked Brynden. Drahar intends to distract us with his infantry by charging them straight at us now whilst his cavalry mass to our western flank and smash us when they do so. As they attempt to charge the flank, you will intercept them and crush them. And once they are routed, reform and prepare to charge on their flank when you hear my horn, Ned ordered. And who takes the city? Asked Elbereth. Theo Valshale. He and his mountain clansmen, Ned replied before turning and nodding towards the clan champion of Clan Val. Theo, whom Robert remembered from the rebellion, nodded in Ned's direction and saluted him with his huge axe. Elbereth and Brynden left to command the 2 halves of their cavalry, whilst Robert commanded the infantry of the Stormlands. Robert would have had it no other way. He wanted to swing his hammer at the moment. And to make them all tremble before his hammer and the banners of mighty House Baratheon. Robert looked ahead at the charging Mirish infantry. They were all roaring and shouting as they began to charge at them. As they did, Robert felt it in his heart and in his blood. His heart pounded with adrenaline and his blood flowed with the thrill of battle. This is what a true warrior lives for. Mirish crossbowmen began to halt. They started to fire upon them. Shields up, Shields up, lads. Don't be the first stupid cunt to die on the first day of the war. Robert roared for all his countrymen to hear. They laughed behind him and to his left and right. Robert held up his beloved escutcheon, forged by Donal soon after he wiped out the bandits of the Mistwood. It was the same length and width of his breastplate and decorated with the proud sigil of the jumping stag of House Baratheon and the words "Ours is the Fury" engraved on the top and the bottom of the great shield. Thrice it was struck by crossbow bolts. Crossbows are a pathetic weapon. Take too long to load. By the time that 3 crossbowmen have shot at me and have either missed or been blocked by my shield, I will have killed all 3 of them before they have even reloaded. Archers. Draw knock. Loose. Let them have every arrow, lads, commanded Titus Blackwood. Hundreds of Mirish infantry and archers fell to their arrows. The famed Mirish crossbowmen ceased firing to avoid hitting their own troops and began to draw swords to join battle. But little good that will do for them, Robert decided as he locked his shield with the men beside him. Charge! Ned roared for all to hear as he unsheathed dice and pointed at the Mirish army. Oh, glorious, Robert muttered with a smile. Charge, lads! For the Stormlands! Slaughter all these cunts! Show them how true men of the Stormlands fight! Robert shouted for his countrymen to hear. Robert roared long and loud as he charged towards them, holding his great hammer in one hand and his escutcheon in his other hand. And as they came closer, Robert realized why Ned waited until the last moment for them to charge. For he saw how tired and winded the mermen were by charging towards them for what seemed like a kilometer, and in the hot climate of Myr. Gods, I have missed this! Robert roared as swung his hammer across. The blow battered down 5 men, killing them instantly. He thrusted his hammer into the groin of another. He collapsed to his knees before Robert finished him off by stomping on his neck. Robert swung his shield across at another who wore no helm. Blood splattered from his mouth as his jaw broke from the impact of the swing of his shield. Robert swung onto another merman, crushing his skull into pieces as it landed on his head. Next, Robert swung across at 2 more men charging at him. The blow killed them both when his hammer smashed their faces. A large Mirish warrior charged at Robert with a big axe. He swung it at Robert. Robert held his shield up, blocking the blow. Robert replied by swinging his hammer at his helm. His helm and his skull splattered into tiny pieces of blood, brains and steel as Robert ripped his hammer away. Robert kicked a man to the ground. Storm's End. Ours is the Fury! Robert roared with pride as he smashed the rim of his shield onto the fallen man's neck. He swung his hammer across, killing 3 more men before he bashed his shield against another man. He thrusted his hammer into his skull whilst a spearman charged at him. His spear struck at Robert's breastplate. The spearhead bounced off, leaving only a small dent on the cuirass, giving Robert more than enough time to swing his shield across the man's face. He fell to the ground, where Robert swung his hammer onto the man's neck. Robert looked up to see crossbowmen aiming for him. When you are so good that you make yourself a marked man by the fucking cowardly archers. Robert held up his shield as he charged towards them. Come and fucking die, he roared before he kicked a crossbowman in the balls. He groaned as he fell to his knees whilst Robert swung his hammer across and killed the second one. And as Robert killed the first one by smashing his shield down on his neck, Robert turned to a third crossbowman. He fired at Robert. Robert felt it when the bolts struck his armor. He was knocked back a pace. But he looked down. And he saw the bolts had merely bounced off his armor. Ha, he taunted before he charged at the crossbowman. He swung his hammer at his head. His head smashed into pieces before he heard Ned's horn. When the enemy hears that horn, it means that they have not long left to live, Robert thought with a grin before he could see Brynden leading the cavalry of the north and the Riverlands and Elbereth leading the cavalry of the Vale and the Stormlands. And then Robert saw him. He grinned when he saw the man who could only be the Mirish Gonfalonia. Robert saw as he tried to lead the remainder of the cavalry away. But Robert wasn't going to let him escape. And neither would Theoval, Robert remembered when he saw the gateway were taken. The flags at the gatehouse were torn down and replaced by flags of House Stark, and the men at the gatehouse were cheering as they watched the battle below. Robert laughed as he ran towards Drahar as he was shouting commands. He swung his shield across at a man trying to stab him with his sword. "Get out of my fucking way!" Robert roared as he got closer to Drahar. The Mirish cavalry with Drahar spotted Robert. "Kill him!" Drahar commanded. Robert swung his hammer across at two horsemen coming at him. They both collapsed from their saddles, dead, before Robert swung his shield across at another. He fell from his saddle and landed on his back. Robert stomped on his skull, feeling the squelching of blood and brains as he ripped his boot away. Drahar drew his arrow and charged at Robert. Robert laughed before he let loose his shield from his hand. He watched as the shield flew across the air and knocked Drahar from his horse. "Come and fight me like a man. Or run like a coward." Robert roared as Drahar stood up. Drahar yelled as he swung his arrow at Robert. Robert held his hammer up and blocked the swing before parrying it aside and swinging his hammer into his chest. He screamed and spat out blood as he fell to his knees, coughing up blood and looking up at Robert. Robert lifted his hammer high and smashed it down. Notes: the Mirish army is crushed and Myr has fallen. Not good news for the Triarchy. Chapter 122, Glory and Prestige. Summary. Lyanna hears news from the warfront and receives an offer of help. Whilst Caitlin speaks with her brother-in-law and her aunt-in-law. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Lyanna 13. "How are you feeling, my lady?" asked Rugger Wensington, the long-serving steward of Storm's End. "Better now that I have had some water," Lyanna replied as she returned to her chair in her bedchambers. In her state, she told Rugger and Maester Joan that she would do her duties as Lady of Storm's End whilst Robert was gone in their bedchambers. For there was a chamber pot in their bedchambers and the privy chamber was closer to it than it was to Robert's solar. "And how are Renly's lessons going, do you know?" asked Lyanna. "Joan tells me that he is very studious and a good learner," he complimented with a smile. Lyanna beamed with pride for her good brother. Whom didn't quite remind her of Benjen. But he was Robert's brother nonetheless, and he adored him dearly. As did Stannis, even if he never physically showed it. Lyanna turned to the door when she heard it open. She beamed when she saw Nara, her handmaiden and friend, stood at the door and was holding Gendry's hand and guiding him as he walked slowly. At 9 moons, Gendry was first starting to walk. And Lyanna beamed with every step he made. This little stag wanted his mother after playing in the nursery with the wet nurses, milady. They were giggling as they were playing with him, said Nara. I am sure that they won't be the last women to giggle in his presence, especially when he gets older, jested Rugger. Rugger. Not in front of his mother. Lyanna replied jestfully. I would hear that sort of talk from Brandon and his friends all of the time. Nara sat down beside Lyanna and helped Gendry sit on Lyanna's lap. Lyanna gently hugged Gendry and kissed his forehead gently. Have you been a good boy, Gendry? He smiled mischievously in reply. Lyanna turned to Nara. And how is Maya? She asked with a smile. She is well. She misses her father. But has taken a great interest in watching horses come and go from the balcony, she replied. Lyanna smiled with approval at that. Sounds like me when I was her age, Lyanna commented before she affectionately kissed Gendry's head again. Lyanna looked up when she heard footsteps. She saw Joan enter, holding 2 letters. Is all well, Maester? She asked. Joan walked up to her and passed the letters. Yes, my lady. But these have just arrived. One is from Lord Robert and the other is from Lord Robert's grandfather, Lord Boros Estermont. Lyanna gently passed Gendry to Nara. Nara beamed as she held Gendry on her lap and made silly faces for him. Lyanna smiled when she listened to Gendry giggle at the silly faces Nara did for him. Lyanna broke the seal of the first letter, when she recognized the handwriting of Robert. Lyanna, my love. We have won a great victory that the Triarchy never saw coming. Ned had already won a battle at the Red Beach on the borders between Myr and Pentos, crushing the Pentoshi army, where the great Yonumber beheaded the Prince of Pentos himself. They now call him the Princeslayer and he has renamed his family's sword Princhesban. But our own victory was at Myr itself, where we crushed the entire Mirish army and took the city. I myself slew the Mirish Gonfalonia, Balaquodrahar, before we took the city. Ned hasn't sacked the city and intends to use the city's vast amounts of Mirish glass to send to the north, the Iron Islands and the Vale to build glass gardens. I look forward to the war's end and seeing you, Gendry, and our next child. May the Seven watch over you, my love. Robert. Lyanna beamed at the news that they had won 2 great victories against the Triarchy. She was amazed that they had captured Myr itself, and were relieving it of as much glass as they could find. Father would be proud that he does not resort to sacking the city. But he is doing the right thing. The North would make good use of the glass for glass gardens. For when winter comes, the North will need as much food as it can get. And better that the North grows it than being reliant on the likes of the greedy Tyrells. Lyanna smiled before she put that letter down and picked up the other letter. She had only ever met Boros Estermont twice. The first was at her first ever feast as Lady of Storm's End when Robert announced his great plans for the future. And the second was at a feast which Robert hosted in honor of Gendry's birth, and Boros Estermont beamed at meeting his great-grandson. Lyanna. In view of the majority of the Stormlands fighting men fighting in Essos against the might of the Triarchy and the Black Fires, I offer to come to Storm's End to help with whatever I can for our families across the Narrow Sea and having supplies shipped there. Let me know your answer as soon as you can, please. Boros Estermont. Lyanna looked up at Maester Joan. Maester, what make you of Robert's grandfather and this offer? She asked. He read the letter and pursed his lips as he did so. Rugger read the letter with him whilst Nara left with Gendry to take him to his nursery. My lady, Lord Estermont has many good shipping connections with Bravos and across the Narrow Sea. They could be put to good use to delivering much-needed supplies and reinforcements, if needed, to your Lord Brother and Lord Husband in their campaign, especially in unfamiliar lands and when they are not sacking needlessly, said Joan. Lyanna liked the Maester of Storm's End. Though she liked Cresson more before he left with Stannis, she also liked Joan. He was wiser than Warlers. He was more patient and kinder. And he was not so dismissive of women and what they were capable of. Which, in his words, he got from my dear old mother, who taught me that women are oft-times as capable as men are and can achieve what they can. Very well. Send a reply to Estermont and tell him that I accept his offer and ask that he come as soon as he is able, said Lyanna. Of course, my lady. But would you not prefer to write the letter yourself? He asked. I would, Maester. But I feel the need to go to the privy right this moment, she replied before standing up. As he left for his solar, Rugger helped Lyanna to the privy. Catelyn X. Don't let Cersei get to you. That was what Catelyn reminded herself the more that she lived in Casterly Rock. She wasn't going to let Cersei's bitterness get the better of her. Nor would she let her win whatever feud that she imagined that she had with Catelyn. Do not let Cersei's bitterness antagonize you. She is envious that you will be Lady of Casterly Rock and that she will not. She has always considered herself father's true heir and that she is father but in a woman's body. In truth, the only quality she has is her beauty. She does not possess the famous Lannister wit, intelligence or the bark or bite of a lion, Tyrion had told her. But whilst she was determined to not let Cersei's antagonization upset Catelyn, she was irritated by Jaime's reluctance to speak to her. Or for them to even be husband and wife. Indeed, the only kiss they had ever was on their wedding day. For insight, Catelyn turned to Jenna, whom was only too happy to help Catelyn with what she needed. They spoke together in Tywin's solar. He would never speak to me. Most of the time, he would look as though he was reliving a night terror right before his own eyes, Catelyn explained to her. Jenna grimaced as she sat down with her and ate from a small bowl of grapes. It isn't easy for Jaime, dear. As well as losing his mother at a young age, he only had Tywin to raise him. And I think you know him well enough to know that he is many things, but a good father, he is not. Well, that's true enough. I am glad that he was never my father. But Jaime never had an easy time when he was forced into the Kingsguard for Aes. He wanted him as a hostage to anger Tywin rather than as a protector. And Aes would force him to bear witness to horrific acts, such as the murder of your late betrothed, she explained. Catelyn frowned at the mention of Bran. And how he was murdered. And now that she realized how Jaime bore witness to it. Catelyn considered this before they turned to the door upon hearing someone knock. The door opened to a certain man of small height. I hope that I am not interrupting, Tyrion asked with a chuckle. Not at all, Tyrion. We were just discussing your brother, Jenna replied before Tyrion sat down beside his aunt. Ah. Has he sent any letters from the Crown Lands? He asked. He has not. I just do not want him to think that he is alone. But at the same time, I do not want to push too far and intrude on whatever it is that he is going through, Catelyn explained. Tyrion smiled at that. Jaime knows this, Cat. I am sure of it. He will see for himself when he does return from the war, said Tyrion. But then Tyrion looked down at the parchments on his father's desk. And what are all of these? He asked. Catelyn decided that now was the time. They knew her good father better than she ever would. And therefore, she would need their advice before she would go forwards with something such as this. It is what I hope can be achieved for the Westerlands, she explained before she passed the parchments to Tyrion and to Jenna. They were sketches of aqueducts, Valyrian roads, dams and Yetish terrace farms. They had been sent to her by Raven by father on her request, to show them to Jenna and Tyrion for their recommendation, and whether they could pursue this without Tywin knowing. Are these the great innovations brought to the Riverlands, the Stormlands and the Vale, all introduced to them by the North? Asked Tyrion before glancing at the sketches that Jenna was looking at. They are. And I thought that it would be of incredible benefit to the Westerlands if they were introduced to the country. Especially with the Yetish terrace farms, it would mean that farms could be cultivated, and crops grown on the many hills and mountains in the Westerlands, she explained. It's very good, Cat. Very good indeed. The only drawback, I fear, is Tywin more than anything, said Jenna. What do you mean? Asked Catelyn. It's not to say that he would not see the value in these great works of foreign architecture. But his pride would be an obstacle, in that he would be irritated that he was not the first to introduce these great marvels of architecture to the Seven Kingdoms. If he was, he would be selling the methods to build them to the rest of the kingdoms, and it would all add to his legacy, and to that of House Lannister's prestige, said Jenna. Is his pride so great that he would reject these out of anger for not being the one to bring them to Westeros? Asked Catelyn. Not forthright. He would be annoyed, most assuredly. But this, he would eventually put aside his annoyance once he saw the benefits and saw how the Westerlands would benefit from it all in the long run, said Tyrion. But the question remains, how do we progress with this? Whom do we approach? Asked Jenna. Catelyn turned to Tyrion. Tyrion, I would ask that you go to Winterfell and act as an emissary on behalf of House Lannister to the Starks and ask Ashura Stark to bring this development to the Westerlands. The Dornish woman whom is what I could never be with Bran. Lady of Winterfell. Tyrion pursed his lips with a nod. Well, I have always wanted to see the North and the Wall. Might I be permitted to visit the latter before I leave Winterfell for home? Asked Tyrion. Of course, Catelyn replied. Well, then I shall be glad to go. But what are we willing to offer to the Starks for this development? Asked Tyrion. Negotiate as best as you can and offer what prices that you would say are the most reasonable. Notes. Lyanna, inexperienced with ruling Storm's End, rules it now with the help of Renly, Maester Joan and Robert's Estermont grandfather. Whilst Catelyn has learned more of Jaime from Tyrion and Jenna whilst planning to advance the Westerlands. Chapter 123, Ransoming a City. Summary. They deal with Myr and the Myrish government whilst still occupying the city. And Valerie's plans a counter-attack on them. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Elberot 17. Uncle John would be proud of Ned's approach to the Myrish and the fact that we are not sacking the city nor willfully harming the small folk. Elberot was stood in the meeting chambers of the Great Conclave, right at the center of the city, where the magisters would debate and enact laws, which was walled off from the rest of the city, like a keep being walled off from the rest of the castle, Elberot had decided. The magisters of Myr had been kept under house arrest whilst the army occupied the city. Ned had promised them that they would not loot or sack the city. But he did require them to pay a ransom for leaving the city untouched and leaving for good once they were ready to march. The magisters had agreed. And now, a week after the great battle of Myr, the ransom was brought and shown to the nobles of the Westerosi army. Gods, what a ransom this is! Elberot looked at what lay before them in finely made chests of wood and gilded gold and brass. Gold, silver, gemstones and Myrish glass, a product from which Myr was one of the few places in the world that produced high-quality glass. How much has been produced of each of these goods? Asked Brindon. The intermediary chosen to act as liaison between they and the magisters of MYR, Magister Jairano Fayan, drew a parchment and read from it. 100 chests of gold, 200 chests of silver, 50 of gemstones and jewelry and 200 crates of glass panels, he announced. Ned nodded before he turned to him. We accept, Magister. Once this is all loaded aboard our transport ships, we will leave MYR for good, as promised, said Ned. And we thank you for your congeniality and your equitable judgment, Lord Stark, said the fat and sweating Magister before he took his leave. Ned turned to face Elbert, Robert, Brindon and their respective bannermen. The gold, silver, gemstones and jewelry are all well and good, but it is the glass that will be of enormous benefit. We can send it to the north, the Vale and the Iron Islands, that we might build glass gardens, he said. Elbert nodded with a smile at that. Perfect. Ever since we subjugated the hill tribes, we have thousands more people under the rule of House Arin. Though that means more mouths to feed. Glass gardens will make all the difference in times of harvest, especially for a people that have survived off hunting animals and raiding and stealing food for centuries and millennia. Especially when winter comes. How many transport ships will it take to escort them to their destinations, Davos? Robert asked one of his bannermen, a man dressed in simple armor and chainmail and with a sigil he did not recognize on his tabard. I should think about a dozen, if not a few more, my lord, replied Davos. We have plenty for the task of transporting the ransom to the safety of our respective kingdoms. But now we are left to do what now? Asked Brindon. There is still Tioche and Lies. But we cannot take them as easily as we took MYR. Both are cities on islands, said Ned. Then why not send word to Lord Greyjoy? Elbert suggested. They turned to him. What do you mean, Elbert? Asked Robert. If we sent word to Quarian Greyjoy to take Tioche, he could do that easily, especially with the Iron Fleet at his command, said Elbert. Since the Battle of the Red Beach, Quarian Greyjoy had led the Iron Fleet to capture a few dozen Pentoshi merchant vessels before he attacked Pentos itself by sea and burned their war fleet before the Pentoshi Council of Magisters paid a large ransom for them to leave the city, as well as vowing to end their part in the war by withdrawing all of their remaining forces back home. Quarian had agreed and withdrew from the city. He and the Iron Fleet will gladly attack Tioche. But what of our own fleets? What will they do? Asked Robert. We send them to scour the seas of the fleets of enemy warships. But keep well clear of Lies. For that is where all their war fleet has gathered. And we cannot sacrifice our warships to fight them without being united into a fleet large enough to confront them, said Ned. What know we of the rest of the enemy armies? Asked Jon Royce. Only that they are still gathered on the mainland fortresses of Lies and Tioche, Lord Royce. They number well over 200,000 men. And they are awaiting reinforcements from Norfos and Cohor, said Mark Riswell. We may have won a few great victories, my lords, but we have made a large enough hole in the Triarchy and battered them bloody. But we have yet to face their entire army combined, or even the Black Fires, said Gillian Swan. Lord Swan has the right of it, my lords. Now is the time that we call upon King's Landing for help. By now they will have gathered their armies into the Crown Lands and their fleets into Blackwater Bay. We need them all here if we are to win this war, said John O'Sbracken, heir to Stonehenge. Craven are you, Bracken, sneered Titus Blackwood, heir to Raventree Hall. Come closer and call me that, Blackwood, snapped Bracken. Brindon rolled his eyes at the bitter rivals before he forced the two apart. Shut up, both of you. The only one who wins from your quarrelling is not you, Sir Titus, nor you, Sir John O's. It is Deltala, he stated loudly and clearly for all those gathered to hear. Ned broke the silence. Once we have gathered the ransom aboard the ships, we will prepare to leave the city. But first, we must know what armies are coming towards MYR and where from. I will not leave the city only to march straight into a trap. In the meantime, I will send word to Lord Greyjoy to take Tioche however he can. However he can. He may just see that as leave to sack the city in true Ironborn fashion, Elbert thought with a grimace. Vargid 19. What the fuck? How the fuck could this have happened? Gods. We should have reached out to Stark and offered a bribe to him. If we had, he may have just taken it and returned home to the north and let Maegor take the Iron Throne and slay his hated rival, Rhaegar. Vargid gulped at the thought of returning to Valerie's and being the one to bring him the news. But he knew it had to be done. For the Mirish army sent to defeat Stark was crushed. And Drahar was dead. His head destroyed by the hammer of Robert Baratheon. And then there was the news that their position in the Narrow Sea was in tatters. For Quarian Greyjoy had struck at Pentos with such a blow that they had left the war entirely. And the fleets of the north, the Iron Islands, the Riverlands, the Vale and the Stormlands were defeating naval patrols they had sent out as well as capturing merchant ships and taking their goods. All in such a way that no merchant ship was daring to sail in the vicinity of the Narrow Sea, preferring to sail to the eastern seas and to Slavers Bay and to Karth. Vargid rode to Valerie's manse. Arriving, he swiftly climbed down from his horse and quickly made his way to Valerie's solar. As he arrived, he saw Bacietos giving Valerie several documents and letters whilst another slave refilled his cup with a jug of wine. I wonder how he will take the news. He cleared his throat nervously. Valerie's turned and looked up at him. You have the look of a man soon to give me grave news, Valerie's commented as he dipped his quill in its inkpot. I do, he replied. Valerie's finished what he was writing before putting his quill back in its inkpot. He sat up straight on his seat before he looked at Vargid. Well, Vargid. Don't just stand there and gawk. Give me what news there is for me to hear, he said. He needs to hear it. Myr has been taken. By Stark, Tully, Arryn and Baratheon. Valerie's face betrayed nothing. But Vargid saw his dark violet eyes. They widened in shock at the news as they darted to him. Vargid saw how Valerie's inhaled and exhaled before reaching for his cup. He sipped from it before looking down at the letters he had just completed writing. He looked up at Bacietos. Have them delivered right away, he commanded. Yes, Exo, he replied. Both Bacietos and the other slave quickly left the solar. Whilst Vargid stayed. Valerie stood up and turned around. He walked to the window, overlooking all of Lies. How did this happen, he asked. Whilst Drahar and his army battled with the West Aosis, Stark must have realized that the eyes of the garrison would be on the battle and not on the walls. So, he sent a small force of men to climb the walls and take them before opening the gates for their army. And once they had won the battle, they peacefully entered and stormed the city. Whilst they did not sack the city, they did force the magisters of Myr to pay a ransom for them to leave, Vargid explained. Because he had his back to Vargid, he couldn't see Valerie's face and how he was looking right now. He does this to maintain control over himself. And to not lose himself to anger. For if he did that, it would be the first time I had ever seen him do it. I knew of Pentos' defeat and their magisters submitting to Quarian Greyjoy in exchange for a ransom paid to the Iron Fleet. But I did not know of this, Valerie's commented. What would you have me do? Asked Vargid. Valerie's finally turned to face Vargid. Continue mustering our army, whilst I write to our friends in Norphos and Qohor. I will have them distract the West Aosis for as long as possible. Until when? Asked Vargid. Until a new force comes to join the war. The sellsword army that the Pentoshes had hired before they had ceased supporting us in this war, and the Dothraki horde. Both shall be of great use to us. We will wait for them to prepare and join. And once they do, we shall crush them. And not even these mighty and hardened West Aosi warriors and knights can fight 4 large armies at the same time. Notes. Before they can leave Myr, they send word to the Greyjoys to do the same to Tiosh, an island city. Whilst Valerie sends 3 armies to attack them simultaneously. Chapter 124, Discovering Love. Summary. Elia and Baelor continue their affair in the Maiden Vault. But then they receive news from the war. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Elia 19. Elia gasped as his tongue danced in circles around her clit. Gods, his tongue is skilled. Is he telling the truth? That he is a maiden? Elia panted as she felt a climax fast approaching, the more that his tongue licked at her clit and his lips kissed around whilst her hands reached for his mix of dark and golden hair. She beamed as she looked up at the ceiling whilst Baelor held her legs down with both hands. Baelor showed no signs of stopping as Elia's pants and moans became louder and louder. She grabbed a pillow to quieten such sounds. And yet, they did little to stop her whilst she was about to climax. "Bae Bela," she moaned through the pillow. Though she was not watching, she could feel her seed soak Bela's face and neck. "Gods, Bela. Are you sure that I am your first?" "You are very talented," she complimented with a giggle that reminded her of her first days in the water gardens with her friends. "Absolutely, Elia. My love," he whispered with a smile. Before he hovered over her and reached for her face gently and tenderly, staring at her as though she was the most precious and valuable treasure in the world. Bela began to kiss her on the lips as he lowered himself down. Elia gladly returned the kiss, her tongue dancing with his, wet with her seed. Before he began to kiss her jaw and then her neck, leaving kisses from her jaw to her collar until he reached her breasts. Enlarged from giving birth to 3 children, Bela traveled back and forth between each one, nipping, licking and sucking each one before turning to the other one, as if to not make the other jealous of the affection he was showing the first. Elia gasped and moaned whilst beaming down at Bela as he physically loved every inch of her body, with his hands wandering every inch with a gentle touch. "I could let him do this to me every day. And I would never tire of how he does it," she thought as she smiled at her lover before resting her head on her pillow, wet from biting it. Elia at first felt disappointment when he had stopped. She opened her eyes and looked down, only to see himself panting as he began to line his member against where he had just been feasting only minutes ago. "Come, Bela," she said with a beaming smile. Bela lovingly stared into Elia's eyes with his beautiful sapphire blue eyes. He held her hands as he pushed himself inside her. Elia moaned as he thrusted inside of her. They kissed as he continued to press into Elia. "Gods, why did I never feel this way with Roriga? Even when there was love between us, he never treated me this way. As the most wonderful thing in his life. Bela loves me and shows that in everything that he does. He just makes me feel so loved and so happy." Elia broke from the kiss. She gasped as she needed to moan without biting Bela's lip. Especially as she climaxed once again. This time, her climax was diluvial, in how it soaked both her and Bela. But it seemed to only drive Bela on even more. With how he continued to thrust inside of her, in sharp distinction to how soft and loving his kisses were and how gently and tenderly his hands wandered around her breasts and her torso. "Bela. Oh, Bela," she moaned as he reached down to kiss her once again. Bela moaned as he gently held her down with one hand pushing down on her shoulder. Before he gasped as he said Elia's name. Elia felt it as he thrusted. She felt as he spent himself inside of her. She sighed happily as she pulled him down beside her, with his member still inside her. She held him close to her. "I love you, Elia. So much," he said as he began to kiss her all over her face and finally on her lips whilst tenderly stroking her hair. "And I love you," she whispered as she held her hand against his cheek. He beamed his beautiful smile at hearing the words whilst he rested his head against her hand, as though relishing in the mere touch of her hand against his face, even after how they made love. Is this how Ash feels when she is with Ned? If so, I no longer feel any envy for her. She has a wonderful, happy and loving marriage with him. Whilst I am not wed to Bela, one day, I hope to be. How much longer can we stay? He asked. Not long, my love, she admitted before she leant in and kissed him gently on the lips. He moaned at feeling her lips on his and ran both his hands through her hair lovingly before wrapping them around her. If I could, I would stay like this with you. All day, he whispered. As would I, said Elia before she lifted herself up. She gasped as she felt his member pull out of her. Quickly, they got dressed, but between every item of clothing, the two shared a kiss. Finally, the two left their rendezvous in the maiden vault. Could my encounters with Bela be the first time in which any such amorous activities took place within these walls? Or did Dana, Elena and Rowena enjoy each other's company? Or did Egon the Unworthy sneak into these walls to have his way with his cousins, giving birth to Demon Blackfear, the ancestor of Magor? Elia returned to Magor's holdfast, quickly having a bath to clean herself of Bela's seed and of the smell of their passionate rendezvous. Remembering her experiences from her days in the water gardens growing up, Elia knew how to clean herself and in what way. Which is how she cleaned herself, with speed and thoroughness. All whilst Oberyn wouldn't even bother cleaning himself up, and was proud to let the world see and smell the evidence of his hedonistic conduct. After her bath, Elia decided to see Roriga. She arrived at his solar, where Sir Jeffrey was stood guard. Is the king inside? She asked. He is, my queen, he replied with a nod. He followed with a knock on the doors. Your Grace, he asked. There was no answer. Your Grace, he called again. Yes. Roriger snapped. Forgive me, Your Grace. The Queen begs leave to enter. Let her in, he barked. Elia gulped as the Red Eagle opened the doors. Does he know? But, we have been careful to make sure that no one has seen us. How could he know? Elia gingerly walked into the solar. Fucking 7 hells. Roriger almost yelled as Elia crossed the threshold, and Sir Geoffrey closed the doors. Concerned, Elia noticed that he was holding a letter in his hands. Thank the gods, she thought. Elia walked to his side and reached for his hands. Roriger, what is it? Has the Triarchy set sail? She asked gently. No. Stark defeated the entire Mirish army and captured their home city, he replied angrily. 7 hells. Ned took MYR. Gods, Ash, is there anything your husband cannot do? But Roriger. Is this grave news? This is a great victory and deals a deadly blow to Daelerys and all morale in his cause and Blackfyr's cause, she said. But it isn't. For Stark has been joined by the Arryn, Baratheon and Tully armies, he stated. Elia frowned at what Roriger was implying. Roriger, your father is dead because he made an enemy of the North. He lost his head because he murdered Rickard and Brandon Stark for no other reason than the fact that they traded with a man who is now our enemy. Not that they would have known it back then. But do not make yourself another Targaryen king to follow his example. The realm has already suffered a devastating war because of the North destroying southern armies quicker than Dawn had done in Daeron's invasion. Do not repeat that war. Roriger, I am going to tell you this once, so for the love of the 7, listen to me. Roriger turned to face her whilst Elia looked up at him with an austere and earnest look. Roriger, this war has started because of Blackfyr and Daltala. And yet, whilst you have been shoring up defences in the Crown lands and gathering armies and fleets, Eddard Stark has been crushing armies of our enemies. He has been doing this on his own until he was joined by his allies. But when this war comes to an end, how will it be remembered? That all the 7 kingdoms were united behind a common cause to crush the threat of the Triarchy and Blackfyr? Or that whilst the king stayed at home with half of the armies and fleets, the other half was covering themselves in glory from Pentos to Volantis? Notes. I thought it appropriate that they have their affair in the Maiden Vault. Consider how nothing of the sort happened when Baelor the Blessed ruled. As much as Elia tries to convince Roriger to not treat Ned as an enemy, all that his father had told him in their last meeting continues to gnaw at his mind. Chapter 125, 3 Armies. Summary. They learn of the armies Varys has sent to them. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Brynden 13. What? Asked Ned. Ned. They've got 3 armies coming at us. One of Dothraki and Pentoshi sellswords. One of Kohorix and Norvishes. And one of Volantens, said Sir Mark Riswell. 7 hells. 3 armies. Our army has just gotten used to sleeping in tents again after leaving MYR. This only puts us into a very difficult position. We cannot simply attack just one army. It would give the other 2 armies time to muster and attack us from all sides. And they have a horde of Dothraki. Many of the men will have grown up hearing the tales and legends of the Dothraki. Of their ferocious blood riders and their terrifying screamers, whose voices gave rise to the terror instilled in thousands across Essos. I remember killing Dothraki warriors in the Stepstones whom served Maelys Blackfyr. And they were fearsome warriors, even though they fought with barely any armor on, and that they were rarely a match for a man wearing armor. What are our options then? Asked Robert. Not many. With 3 armies closing in on us, from the east, from the north and from the south, we have little chance of rushing out to confront just one army. Especially the Dothraki. They would ride us down as we marched and cut us down after taunting us by shooting from afar whilst riding in circles around the entire army on horseback, said Bronze Yone. Brynden frowned when he looked at the map. Camped as they were on the outskirts of the village of Garrow, Brynden knew that they were vulnerable. For the Pentoshi Dothraki army were coming towards them from the north, from Goyandroi, and were soon to near the border town of Viletrees. The Novoshikohuric army was soon to approach the Mirish town of Naxember. And the Volonten army was several days away from Myr itself. With these armies closing in on us, we will be trapped like rats. If we stay here, we will run down by the Dothraki and slaughtered by the rest of their infantry. If we try and confront one army, the other two will butcher us from the flanks. And the king is still in King's Landing with the other armies, doing nothing, Brynden stated, much to the chagrin of the Riverlords, Valorlords and Stormlords who were loyal to the king and to House Targaryen. He looked up at Ned, who was glaring down at the map. Could we not try and take the city again, suggested Ronald Connington. No. We took it in the first place by surprise. We wouldn't be able to do the same again. If we tried to besiege it, the garrison and the armies would slaughter us. And even if we succeeded, they would besiege us with all their forces and all the time in the world, said Willis Marndale. Where is Lord Greyjoy and the fleets? Asked Elbert. Battering the fleets before he moves on to Teosh, Robert replied. We could send word for our own fleets to pick us up whilst the Iron Fleet does what it does best and keeps their own fleets distracted, suggested Ballion Morrigan. No, Lord Morrigan. We would still be left with their armies to fight, said Robert's brother Stannis. Even if we sent a raven to King's Landing, it would take weeks, perhaps moons, for the king and his armies to board their ships and sail here to join the war. And that is all time that we do not have. When those armies are closing in on us with speed, quietly said the chillingly quiet Roose Bolton, forcing all nearby to listen carefully to his voice. How many are there in each army, Sir Mark? Asked Brynden. 25,000 in the Pentoshi army and Dothraki horde, Sir Brynden. 40,000 in the army from Norphos and Qohor. And 35,000 Volantens in their army advancing, he said. A combined total of 100,000 men. They outnumber us by 25,000 men. Then we will do the same as them. Brynden raised a brow at Ned's words as all turned to face him, wondering what he was saying. Brynden knew that he was on to something, for Ned always came up with brilliant tactics and plans. He just had not understood yet what he was getting to. What do you mean, Lord Stark? Asked Jason Mallister. The fact is that we must divide our forces. They are divided into three and will attack us as such because they know that if they attacked us as three from all sides, they would be victorious. But if we deny them of such a chance of a quick and easy victory, we stand a chance of winning, by defeating these three armies. By dividing to confront each of these armies, simultaneously, Lord Stark, asked Aemon Estermont. I will lead the Northern army to fight the Norvishes and Qohorics. Lord Baratheon will lead the Stormlands army to fight the Pentoshes and Dothraki. And Sir Brynden and Sir Elbert shall combine forces and attack the Volantens, he said. Brynden nodded. It makes sense. And he is right. We have a chance of 3 victories if we confronted them by dividing and facing them at the same time, rather than risk being slaughtered by letting them attack us. When do we move out, Lord Stark? Asked Ricard Karstark. Today. Soon after a quick lunch. We must make a move and march to regain the momentum. Once we do, we can reunite forces and march south to confront their armies. By which stage, the king should have made sail and prepared to join his armies with ours, he said. Notes. Divide and conquer, as Julius Caesar said. Chapter 126, Nelavar. Summary. Robert leads the Stormlands army against the combined army of sellswords and Dothraki at Nelavar. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Robert the 17th. Robert took his hammer from Artyom, who shivered as he heard it. All around Robert trembled as they heard it. Even he shivered as he heard it. But he kept a firm grip on his hammer. And antler sheathed at his side. Knowing that he had to face them. Warrior, stand with us. Aid us in this fight against these barbarians. These savages who massacre thousands of innocents across Essos. And sell all survivors of their raids in the thousands. With cliffs to their west and steep and rocky hills and the town of Nelavar to their east, and open ground to their north and south, Robert felt vulnerable as he looked to his north. And they appeared, their hoots and cries finally given form as thousands of Dothraki riders appeared. Gods, Robert thought as he stared ahead at the Dothraki, all forming a large and extended line, bows and arrows drawn. This is what we came for. To fight these bastards. and their Pentoshi allies. We will show them. We will show them how Stormlanders fight. Robert allowed himself a smile as he placed his helm on his head. A helm prepared by Donal Noye. An armlet and with steel stag antlers protruding from the sides. He was glad to take this helm into battle rather than using an ordinary one as he had done in the battles of the Northern Rebellion. But now, leading an army of proud and hardy Stormlander knights and warriors, Robert felt the pride soaring in his heart, fueling him to swing his hammer and slaughter all Dothraki that did come to fight for the Triarchy and the Black Fires. Robert looked around at the deception they had created. They had constructed a large campsite, preparing only a few defenses such as sharpened stakes, laying on the ground, waiting to be pulled up by rope when they came close enough. All to give the impression to the Dothraki that they were easy pickings. And yet, the best was that the cavalry was nowhere to be seen. Robert had learned plenty from Ned's tactics in the battles of the Northern Rebellion. He had given command of the 4,000 knights and cavalry to Gillian Swan, who had led them to gather to the east, and to descend on the Dothraki once they were attacking their positions. And near-naked Dothraki would stand a little chance against armored knights with lances on armored horses, giving them the advantage they needed against the Dothraki. Before they would face the Pentoshes, the Dothraki began to chant and raise their arrows in the air as one of their own. A heavily scarred man riding a copper-colored stallion was riding up and down the line, wielding 2 large arrows. Kul Balak Ho, Robert realized as he held his hammer up and his shield ready to block against arrows. Until the Dothraki began to chant louder and louder. Robert felt no fear as he stared ahead at them, as they began to slowly approach. He gulped as he turned his head to his left and then to his right. He saw his men as they began to form ranks and hold weapons and shields to the ready. Show no fear, boys. With me now, he roared before his voice softened into song. Sons of the storm. We'll never yield. Through blazing fire and bleeding field, my brother's body I'll give me shield. Sons of the storm. We'll never yield. The approaching Dothraki suddenly stopped their chanting, as if they were focusing on the Stormlanders, defiantly singing as they prepared to charge. Until Kul Balak Ho shouted louder command. And they now broke into an enormous charge, whilst horse archers began to hold bows up and take arrows from quivers. Sons of the storm. The journey's past. Through fire and ruin. We'll keep our task. My body's broken. I'll never yield. Robert felt his heart bounding as they reached the final verse. He felt no fear in his heart as he stared at the oncoming Dothraki. He only felt adrenaline for the fight, and pride in his brave men, standing side by side, as true Stormlanders. He bashed his hammer against his shield. He was joined by the rest of the army as they sang the final lines. Sons of the storm. Sons of the storm. Robert roared as he saw them knock arrows and draw them back. Shields up. Shields up, he roared. He snarled as he felt his shield shake with each strike from an arrow at it. But no arrows were stuck in the shield. They merely bounced off, leaving a small dent where it struck. He waited until they came closer. Just a little closer. Come on. Robert grimaced when he heard the screams of men behind him and to his side being wounded or killed. Dothraki cowards. He smiled as they came closer. Now, needing no further command, Cousin Eamon and Ralph Buckler pulled up the ropes whilst taking cover behind shields, and the defences propped up. Fences of sharpened stakes were held up by the ropes, and the Dothraki horses charged straight into them. Shoot! Robert commanded. The archers knocked, drew and shot. The front lines of Dothraki, once hooting and taunting, were now screaming and shouting as their horses became impaled on the stakes or fell from their horses or were colliding into the wounded, dying or dead horses and men. And now they were being shot at by their archers. Robert roared as he took a spear and threw it at a Dothraki blood rider. The spear caught him in his rib cage. He screamed as he fell onto the ground, the spear hitting the ground first. Whilst the rear end of the shaft snapped upon hitting the blooded grounds first, the rest impaled itself further into his body, prolonging the man's suffering until he finally died. The archers continually shot at the Dothraki as they tried to reform their disorganized lines. Now! Charge! Kill them! Kill them all! Robert roared as he charged, wielding his hammer and shield. He was joined by his countrymen, roaring also as they joined the charge with sword, spear, axe, mace and shield. Robert swung his hammer across at a dismounted Dothraki whom walked with a limp. The Dothraki was not quick enough to block his hammer, for it crushed the side of his head upon hitting it. Next, he swung his shield across at the chest of a mounted Dothraki. He fell to the ground but pulled himself up to fight Robert. He swiftly swung his arrow at Robert. Robert blocked it with his hammer. He lifted his foot up high and stomped it down on his foot. The Dothraki screamed as the steel boot landed on his fur boot, smashing the bones in his foot. Robert proceeded to swing his shield across his neck, breaking his neck with the rim of his great escutcheon. Robert reached for his war horn. He lifted the visor of his helm and blew into it. Not a foreboding and fearful sound like the northern war horn Ned used, but it delivered the same effect. Indeed, the cavalry of the Stormlands appeared from the east, and with lance, spear, sword and mace, they charged down onto the Dothraki. Robert laughed at their arrival as he tucked his horn away and pulled his visor back down. He looked up and saw Cul Balak-Ho. He had slit the throat of a spearman who had cut at his horse with his spear. Robert charged straight at the Cul, determined to kill him and break the morale of the Dothraki for good. He swung his hammer at his horse's skull. The horse collapsed to the ground, making no sound as it fell to the blooded sands. Cul Balak-Ho screamed with anger as he charged at Robert. Wearing no armor, the Cul was very swift with 2 arrows. Robert saw another dismounted Dothraki come at him with a spear. The spear bounced off his breastplate. And Robert lifted his hammer high and smashed it down on his skull. His hammer was embedded in his head, sticking from his collar, for his completely unprotected head was destroyed from the strike of Robert's hammer. Robert let his hammer fall to the ground with the corpse whilst he drew antler. Cul Balak-Ho swung his arrows at Robert with speed like none other he had ever seen. Robert blocked a swing from both arrows with antler before he swung his shield into Balak-Ho's face. The blow to his face made him stumble back and Robert swung antler down onto him. He held one of his arrows up to block antler. But his arrow did little to protect him against the sword of Valyrian steel, which crushed the arrow into pieces and carved down onto the Dothraki Cul from his shoulder to his chest. He groaned as the blade carved him open. Robert finished him off by slicing his throat before he could try and renew his attack. The Dothraki soon began to retreat. Robert roared as he held up antler and his shield. His fellow Stormlanders also cheered at breaking the Dothraki. "We've done it. We've crushed a horde of Dothraki and slew their Cul." But Robert reminded himself of who else there was to fight when he saw the approaching Pentoshi army. "Infantry, on me. Form up," Robert commanded. He turned to Gillian, wielding a blooded sword and shield. "Wait until we charge their front lines and flank them from both sides," Robert commanded. "Yes, my lord," he said, followed by a salute with his sword. Robert panted as the infantry reformed with him. He inhaled and exhaled as they were readying to face the oncoming threat. "With me now. Charge!" Robert roared as he was the first to charge. They followed him, shouting taunts and threats at the Pentoshi Cheesemongers, slowly marching on them. Robert roared as he came within 10 feet of him. He swung his hammer across as he closed within half the distance between he and them. And as he came close enough, 5 men were killed by the swing of his hammer. A spearman thrusted his spear at him. Robert parried it aside with his shield and thrusted his hammer into his skull, smashing his entire face. He was glad when he saw the arrival of Gillian and their knights and cavalry. They had smashed into both flanks of the Pentoshis. "We've won. By the warrior, we have won. And what glory this brings me and House Baratheon." Notes: Robert's personal victory and first battle he has commanded and won. And I really enjoyed writing the part where the Dothraki chant and the Stormlanders sing. I based it on my favorite scene from the film Zulu. Chapter 127, Caseríos. Summary. Ned fights against the combined army of Norvishes and Cohorics. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Eddard Xiv. Eddard smiled when he saw Mark riding towards him. "They march for the top of the ridge," Ned said. "Mark." "Aye, they do. But they'll soon find us here, Eddard replied as he reached for the hilt and unsheathed ice from his back. Eddard placed his direwolf helm firmly on his head. He twitched as he could hear the Norvoshi commanders shout at their men. But he did not hear any war horns, nor panicked shouting, nor urgent commands being given. They do not know we are here. All the better. Eddard felt himself turn into his first form, feeling his fangs and pincers on his lips. He let out a quiet and unearthly growl as he lifted ice up high for all to see. On me, Eddard commanded, but his voice was not raised to a shout. Those who heard him followed soon after by their comrades behind them. Following him, the northern infantry quietly marched to the top of the ridge. The ridge by the Mirish village of Cassarios was key to the battlefield, Eddard understood when he had first seen it on a map. And seeing it in person the day before, Eddard decided how they would fight the approaching army of Norvashis and Kohuriks. He would let them think that the way to Myi was safe, and that their army was still at Gararo. Whilst the best riders of House Riswell pursued their scouts, killing them off, the allied army approached Cassarios Ridge, not knowing that the northern army was there, or that on their northeastern flank was being watched by the cavalry commanded by Roose Bolton. And on their southeastern flank, the Knights of White Harbour were also watching, commanded by Sir Willis. Both cavalry forces were waiting for Eddard to give his signal with his war horn. "Come on. Just a little closer," Eddard said inwardly as he quietly made his way to the top of the ridge, willing the northern army to get there first. And quietly, to avoid arousing the suspicions of the Norvashis and Kohuriks. He could hear them all. He could hear thousands of pairs of feet marching on the Valyrian road that stretched from Pentos to Kohor. He could hear the hooves of horses on the sands, rocks and the road. He could hear the irritated mutterings of Norvoshi and Kohurik soldiers. He could hear the shouting of commands from officers and commanders. But none were aroused by suspicion, he was glad to hear. Eddard looked up at the top of the ridge, where there were no soldiers, cavalry or commanders already there. And the top was only 10 feet away from where he was. This is it. We have done it. He turned around to face the undefeated northern army. "Let all the scum hear you now, warriors of the north!" Eddard shouted, his voice raised as loud as he could. All northern infantry roared and hooted as they charged the last 10 feet to the top of the ridge. As he reached the top, he looked down on the other side, where frightened and surprised Norvoshi and Kohurik infantry and cavalry stared at him. Eddard roared as he swung ice as far as he could. As he swung it across, he had beheaded 8 men before he stabbed another before he could thrust his spear at Eddard's head. Eddard looked around to see the arrival of the northern infantry. With Jorah Mormont, Great Yonumber, Ricard Carstark, Gregor Forrester, William Dustin, Theo Val, Ronald Harkley and Brandon Norrie charging down with their best infantry behind them. Eddard eviscerated an Unsullied before swinging ice across at 3 Unsullied advancing on him. They made no sound of pain as he bisected the 3 of them with said blow. He turned and stabbed another Unsullied before grabbing his spear and his sword. Eddard threw the spear at a general shouting commands to the men. And he threw the sword at a man reaching for a war horn. Both weapons struck and killed their targets. As the enemy lines were being attacked from the entire front, Eddard smirked that they had achieved the first part of his plan. Now the second part. Push. Push them back. Push them back down. Eddard roared. Eddard stabbed another soldier before using him as a shield and to push into more of them and push them back. Inadvertently, more men stabbed into the blade impaling the first soldier's stomach. Eddard nodded when he realized that they were fast losing ground. The Norvashis and Kohuriks were being pushed back by the brute force of their attack and that they were pushing down on them with shields and strength. Eddard turned his head to see the archers taking position. "Archers," he roared. Their commander, Robert Glover, nodded when he heard Ned's command. "Archers. Knock. Draw." 3,000 archers drew bowstrings back, ready to rain death down on them. Loose. Thousands of arrows let loose upon the Norvashis and Kohuriks. Eddard nodded with a smirk at how hundreds of men fell to the arrows in front of him, including flag-bearers holding the flag bearing the 3 bells of Norphos and the flag bearing the black goat of Kohor. Now is the time, Eddard decided as they continued to push down. He lifted his helm off with one hand and held it under his arm whilst he grabbed his war horn. He lifted it to his lips and blew as hard on it as he could. Eddard placed it back on his belt before he placed his helm back on his head. And then he saw the arrival of the cavalry. The knights of White Harbour charged upon the flank of the panicked Norvishes and Cohorix. Whilst the cavalry of Houses Bolton, Riswell, Carstark, Tallheart and Hornwood charged on the opposite flank. "We've won, Northerners. We have won." The men to his sides and behind him all roared and cheered as they held their positions. "Now charge! Charge and break them for good! Slaughter them all! Make them shit themselves every time they see the men of the north!" Eddard roared before charging upon the panicked and terrified Norvishes and Cohorix. Eddard beheaded 3 men with a swing of ice before he eviscerated 2 unsullied and stabbed a general on his horse. He saw how they panicked and screamed and shouted. Hundreds threw down their weapons and begged for mercy in their mother languages, but none were spared in a lust for blood. The cavalry rode down hundreds and thousands as they pushed deeper into their flanks before the 2 armies retreated. Eddard smiled that they had abandoned many of their own banners. A victory for all the north to sing of, lads. Eddard shouted as he stabbed ice into the ground and held up a flag of Norfos with one hand and a flag of Cohor in his other hand. The Northerners all roared and cheered at another great victory. And one step closer to ending this war. Returning home to the north. And being back to my family and to Ash. Notes. Ned's 7th Battle and 7th Victory. Chapter 128, Murmush. Summary. Bryndon leads the combined army of Rivermen and Valiman. Notes. See the end of the chapter for notes. Chapter text. Bryndon 14. Bryndon saw the approach of Morton Wainwood as he rode towards them. "My lords. Their scouts have spotted us. But they have not spotted our infantry," said the heir to Iron Oaks. "Then they take the bait and fall into the trap." "Excellent," Bryndon thought as he turned to Ed Muir. "Are you ready?" he asked his nephew. Ed Muir gulped as he looked up at him. "I'm ready, Uncle," eagerly he said with a nod. Bryndon patted him on the shoulder before looking back up at the chosen battlefield of Murmush. Murmush was a small and isolated fortress. It was built at the borders between Myr and Teosha's lands on the mainland of Essos, and was recently built by the Triarchy before the war began, to act as a forward operating base for troops and for troops to have somewhere to rest from patrolling or for hunting bandits or Dothraki bands. And now the lands surrounding it were to be their battlefield. They had gotten to the fortress first before the large army of Volantens had gotten to it. And now they waited for the larger Volanten army to charge at them. At just the cavalry. Whilst the infantry kept hidden. Both Bryndon and Elberot commanded the cavalry of the Riverlands and the Vale. Whilst the infantry of the Riverlands, commanded by Jason Mallister, and the cavalry of the Vale, commanded by Yone, waited behind the nearby hills. Bryndon chuckled when he remembered the jest told by Yone to Walter Went, commanding the knights and cavalry of House Went. "Lord Royce, why do you choose to fight on foot?" "It is on horseback where knights and warriors are at their best," said the Lord of Harrenhal. "Because it is when on foot, that men are forced to fight their best, against men on foot and on horseback. For you are forced to fight harder than you would on horseback," he said. "True, but surely, as a knight of the Vale, is it not seemlier to fight on your horse?" The Lord of Runestone raised a brow before facing the Lord of Harrenhal. "Lord Went. Fighting in an army with the cavalry but not the infantry, is akin to visiting a brothel and paying for a cuddle." Bryndon held Ed Muir by his shoulder. "Whatever happens, lad, stay by my side. I will fight with you. Every step of the way," he said. "Yes, uncle," he replied whilst nodding. Bryndon patted him on the shoulder once more before he looked down at his belt. He smiled as he looked down at the family sword that was Faith, sheathed there. Bryndon found himself loving to wield Faith. He had fought with it at Myr and had found it far easier to fight with than all other swords he had fought with in the past. He had used 3 swords in his youth at the Stepstones, the first 2 broke whilst fighting pirates and then fighting black Fircell swords. This sword will never break. This sword, of House Tully, shall slaughter many enemies of House Tully. And every Tully after me who wields it will go into legend when they take it into battle. So long as they fight like me and not like Hoster." Bryndon nodded when he saw the Volanten cavalry. including their mighty and famed cataphracts that did break the Dothraki strength at the Battle of Voluntheis. Now to battle, he whispered to himself before placing his helm on his head. His was a simple helm. Like the rest of his armor, the only noticeable thing about it was the color was black and the blackfish crest on the sides. Bryndon's chainmail, his heavy steel plate cuirass, gauntlets, greaves, boots and pauldrons were all black. And the shield he held was decorated with House Tully's colors but for the black jumping trout. Since he took the name, Blackfish, he had embraced what it meant by decorating his armor and shield with black. But he would never do the same to Faith. The sword gifted to them by Ned. The now ancestral sword of House Tully, which had already served him well in battle at Myr. And would do so again, here at Murmush. Lances. At the ready. Elbereth commanded to all cavalry, whether they hailed from the Riverlands or the Vale. All knights took their lances from their squires as well as their shields. Bryndon took up his own lance and inhaled and exhaled gently as the enemy cavalry began to get into formation. "What are they doing, uncle?" asked Edmure. Bryndon fixed his eyes to the enemy before he pulled his helm's visor down. "They intend to lure us to them so that they can fight us before their infantry outflank us," Bryndon realized. "How do you know, Sir Bryndon?" asked Rugger Vance, Lord of Wayfarer's Rest. "Notice how there is no infantry around them," Bryndon pointed out. "But they might be behind them," suggested John Osbracken. "Nay. We would have seen them. They would have paraded their infantry out to show off how many there are before the cavalry would march out. No, they have their infantry hidden. Hidden and ready to flank us if we were to ride out and fight their cavalry." "Then what do we do?" asked Stephen Free. "We wait for them to make the next move. Men of the free cities are impatient and never idle for long. Especially these men, Sir Stephen. For they have no experience of the battlefield. They are Valyrian nobility of Volantis who only last year feasted once a week in manses around their cities and hoard in pleasure houses daily and now think themselves the incarnates of the conquerors of the Valyrian freehold." Bryndon smiled when he saw that they didn't have to wait long for him to be proven right. For a war horn blew from the opposite side of the battlefield. Infantry began to leave from their hiding places. They formed positions. And now the cavalry began to slowly advance towards them. Bryndon raised his lance up high. "Knights! Advance!" Bryndon was the first to ride ahead, with Edmure by his side. They began to slowly advance, for Bryndon did not want to tire them out. He needed them to be full of energy and morale when they crossed swords with the enemy cavalry. Especially if they did as he expected and sent the infantry to surround and flank them. Bryndon waited until they began to quicken their pace. And finally, he lifted his lance up high for all the knights to see. "Charge!" Bryndon shouted for all to hear. Edmure roared as he lowered his lance and pointed it at the enemy, just after Bryndon had lowered his. Bryndon and Elbereth led the charge towards the Volantens. With their cavalry now charging as fast as they could towards them, it was easy. They held up spears and lances and rode under banners of the elephants of Volantis and the tigers of Volantis. Bryndon rarely felt a feeling as glorious as the feeling of adrenaline as he charged into battle. Not knowing whether he was going to live or die. But feeling that he was only a few moments away from certain death. Whose death was never certain. Whether his or the enemy's. Whatever the outcome, Bryndon had always escaped unscathed from such brutal fights and battles since the day he was knighted. Bryndon roared as he charged into the enemy cavalry. His lance snapped in half when he struck the first Volanten horseman. He killed a second by impaling what was left of his lance into the man's sternum. Now, with pride, he unsheathed Faith. He cut across, slicing a man's belly. He fell from his saddle, landing on the roof of his helm. The Blackfish of Riverrun parried aside the arrow of a Valyrian nobleman wearing the sigil of 3 lines of winkle shells engraved on his pauldrons over his lamella cuirass. And Bryndon sliced Faith across at his cuirass. He yelled as Faith sliced him open from one end of his stomach to the other. He collapsed onto the blooded soil and sands before Bryndon beheaded another riding towards him. And then Bryndon came towards several of the cataphracts. Gods, now these men have the look of proper warriors. As opposed to the arrogant boys playing at war I have only just fought. Bryndon clashed against the arrow of one such cataphract. Wearing the mail and plate armor common with cataphracts, this one sliced his arrow across at Bryndon's helm with swift ease. Bryndon blocked the blow with his shield before cutting across at his wrist. He screamed as his hand fell from his wrist, with his fingers still enclosed around his arrow before Bryndon sliced his throat. Bryndon turned, looking around for Edmure. He parried a cataphract's spear aside before stabbing the chest of the cataphract in question, faith piercing through his lamellar cuirass like a hot knife through butter. And he saw Edmure. Edmure threw his dagger at a Valyrian Volanten nobleman. The dagger caught him in the face, and he collapsed from his saddle after Edmure had cut down a cataphract by slicing at his chainmail coif. That's my boy, Bryndon thought with pride before he spotted the approach of the Volanten infantry. He was glad that their infantry did not include the renowned tiger cloaks of Volantis. Bryndon was certain that if they did cross swords with them, they would suffer devastating casualties. Even if they did emerge